For centuries, Zen monks and masters have observed how the human mind manufactures its own suffering, leading them to profound insights about finding inner peace. Tonight, we will delve into these truths, not as rigid rules to be followed or distant goals to be achieved, but as gentle reminders of wisdom you likely already possess deep within. Before we get started, please feel free to share the time and your location in the comments. Zen Buddhism doesn't require any specific beliefs or demand that you transform into someone else. It simply invites you to clearly perceive what is unfolding in this very moment. Our distress often stems not from our circumstances themselves, but from our relationship to them, a relationship that is thankfully capable of shifting. There's no need to strain to concentrate or memorize everything. These teachings have a way of settling into your understanding effortlessly. As you listen, you may notice your breathing becoming more relaxed and your body releasing tension you weren't even aware you were holding. This natural release occurs when the mind encounters something inherently true. So relax, take a slow, deep breath, and let's embark on this journey together. One of the most pervasive sources of human suffering is also one of the most easily overlooked. We cling tightly to things, not just physical objects, but also ideas, desired outcomes, relationships, and fixed notions of how life should be. We grip them tightly, convinced that our happiness hinges on maintaining them exactly as they are. This act of holding on is what Zen Buddhism refers to as attachment. It's different from simply caring about or valuing something. Attachment is the deep-seated belief that we must possess something permanently, that we must control it, and that our well-being is utterly dependent on it remaining unchanged. Given that everything in life is subject to change, this form of attachment inevitably leads to disappointment. We become attached to pleasant experiences, yearning for them to last forever. We cling to comfortable circumstances, resisting any shifts. We become attached to people, often forgetting that everyone is on their own path of growth and transformation. We even become attached to our suffering, constructing identities around our pain, and then clinging to those identities as if they are the very essence of who we are. The peculiar thing about attachment is that it doesn't actually enhance our enjoyment of what we have. In fact, it often hinders it. When we hold something so tightly, consumed by the fear of losing it, we aren't truly experiencing it. We're too preoccupied with worrying about its inevitable loss. Zen teaching offers a different approach, not detachment, which can sound cold and aloof, but rather a kind of open-handed appreciation, fully savoring the present moment while understanding that nothing remains static, loving completely while accepting that all things are in a state of flux. This understanding doesn't diminish our experience, it enriches it. In a small temple on the edge of a forest lived a Zen master named Tenzo. He was widely known for his simplicity and calm demeanor. However, those closest to him knew of his deep connection to his teacup. This teacup was unremarkable in appearance, plain ceramic, slightly asymmetrical, with a pale green glaze that had darkened with years of use. Yet it had belonged to Tenzo's teacher, who had presented it to him decades ago on the day Tenzo completed his training. Every morning, Tenzo would carefully prepare tea and drink it from this cup. He washed it with utmost care after each use and kept it on a special shelf in his small room. Students often noticed the gentle way his hands cradled the cup and how his attention seemed to settle when he held it. One autumn morning, a young monk named Kensho arrived at the temple. He had journeyed far and was eager to begin his studies. Tenzo warmly welcomed him and showed him around the modest grounds. As they entered Tenzo's room, the master went to prepare tea for his guest. Reaching for his teacup, Tenzo's sleeve accidentally brushed against another bowl. The teacup toppled from the shelf and crashed onto the wooden floor, shattering into pieces. Kensho froze, aghast. He had just arrived and already caused his teacher to lose something so cherished. He began to apologize, to offer to replace the cup, to explain that he hadn't intended to crowd the doorway. But Tenzo simply gazed at the broken pieces on the floor, his face calm, almost serene. He bent down and picked up the largest fragment, turning it slowly in his hand. "How beautiful it was," he said quietly. "For all these years it held my tea. Every morning I felt the warmth of the liquid and tasted the leaves. It served its purpose perfectly." He gathered the other pieces and held them in his palm. "My teacher gave me this cup 30 years ago. I've drunk from it every morning since, and now it has completed its journey as a cup. It was whole for exactly as long as it needed to be. Kensho was at a loss for words. Master, I'm so sorry. It was precious to you. It was precious, Tenzo agreed, and now it's something else. These pieces are also precious. They remind me that my teacher is gone, the cup is gone, and someday I will be gone too. Everything passes. This is simply how things are. He picked up another bowl from the shelf, a plain one used by the students. Like, tomorrow I'll drink my tea from this bowl instead. It will serve the same purpose, and I'll remember my teacher when I drink, just as I always have. The memory lives in me, not in the ceramic. Tenzo prepared tea using the simple bowl and offered it to Kensho. They sat together in silence. The broken pieces lay nearby, and Kensho couldn't help but glance at them, still feeling responsible for what had happened. You're wondering if I'm sad, Tenzo said after a while. Yes, I feel the sadness of knowing the cup is gone. That feeling is natural and honest, but I'm not suffering over it. Suffering would arise if I insisted it shouldn't have broken, if I demanded that it still be whole, if I wasted my energy wishing reality were different than it is. He took a sip of tea from the ordinary bowl. The cup breaking is simply what happened. My teacher dying was simply what happened. One day, my own death will be simply what happens. When we stop fighting with what happens, something within us becomes very still. Later that day, Tenzo placed the broken pieces in his garden among the stones and moss. Over time, they settled into the earth, becoming part of the landscape. Students who arrived years later never knew about the teacup, but they all noticed something remarkable about Tenzo. He held things lightly. He appreciated beauty without clinging to it, and he loved without demanding permanence. When students asked him about non-attachment, he would sometimes lead them to the garden and show them the nearly invisible remains of the broken cup, now integrated into the natural elements. I loved that cup, he would say, and loving it didn't require keeping it forever. The love was real, and the loss was real. Both are simply part of how things are, and neither needs to create suffering. This story reveals something profound about the nature of attachment. Tenzo's sadness about the cup breaking was genuine. He had cared for this object, valued it, and connected it with memories of his teacher. The feeling of loss was natural and appropriate. But notice what he didn't do. He didn't transform that natural sadness into suffering by insisting that reality should be different. He didn't rage against the breaking, blame Kensho, or spend days wishing he could undo what had happened. He simply acknowledged what was true. The cup had broken. This was the reality. There's a fundamental insight here regarding the distinction between pain and suffering. Pain is what life inevitably brings us. Loss, disappointment, and change are intrinsic to existence. Everything that comes together eventually falls apart, everything born eventually dies, and everything created eventually breaks. This is simply how things are, and the pain of these natural losses is unavoidable. However, suffering is what we add through our resistance when we fight with reality, insisting it should be different than it is. We create an extra layer of distress on top of the natural pain. We take a moment of loss and extend it into days or even years of suffering by constantly replaying how things should have been. Tenzo's approach reveals another possibility. We can feel the natural sadness of loss without adding the suffering of resistance. We can acknowledge that something precious is gone without expending our energy demanding that it return. This doesn't mean we don't care, it means we care without clinging. The image of the broken cup settling into the garden is a powerful one. What we've lost doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes part of the landscape of our life, part of the soil from which new things grow. But this can only happen when we release our insistence that it remain in its old form. There's another dimension to attachment that manifests differently. Sometimes we cling not to objects, but to outcomes, to how we believe things should unfold. In a village celebrated for its skilled artisans, there lived a wood carver named Isamu. He had learned his trade from his father and had dedicated 30 years to perfecting his skill. He could carve intricate scenes into panels of cedar and cypress, and his work adorned temples and wealthy homes throughout the province. Isamu took immense pride in his precision. Every cut had to be exact. Every detail had to perfectly match his vision. He would spend months on a single panel, adjusting and refining it until it met his exacting standards. His reputation was built on this perfectionism, and he guarded it fiercely. One spring, a merchant commissioned Isamu to create a large panel depicting a mountain landscape for a new temple. The merchant specified exactly what he wanted: a particular mountain, specific trees in the foreground, and a distinctive waterfall. Isamu accepted the commission and began planning the piece. For weeks, he studied the mountain, sketching it from various angles. He selected the finest piece of cedar he could find, completely free of knots or irregularities. He sharpened his tools until they could split a hair, and he prepared his workshop, eliminating any potential distractions. Finally, he began carving. The work progressed smoothly. The mountain began to take shape under his hands, the trees emerged from the wood, and the waterfall seemed to cascade down the panel. Isamu worked with unwavering focus, often forgetting to eat or sleep. This was to be his masterpiece, the work that would secure his legacy. After 2 months of intense carving, the panel was nearing completion. Isamu stepped back to examine it in the morning light. It was perfect. Every line was precisely where it should be. Every detail matched his vision. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction, already envisioning the merchant's reaction, the praise from fellow artisans, and the enhanced reputation this work would bring. That afternoon, as Isamu was preparing to perform the final finishing work, his young nephew came to visit. The boy, perhaps 7 years old, was excited to see his uncle's workshop. Isamu was usually careful about keeping children away from his workspace, but he was in such high spirits about the nearly finished panel that he allowed the boy to enter. "Can I help?" the nephew asked, his eyes wide with wonder at all the tools and wood shavings. "Just watch," Isamu said, smiling. "This is very delicate work." He turned back to the panel, selecting the finishing tool. Behind him, his nephew picked up a carving gouge from the workbench, mimicking his uncle's movements. The boy stepped closer for a better view, and his hand, still holding the tool, swung toward the panel. The gouge struck the wood, cutting a deep, jagged line across the waterfall, completely ruining that section of the carving. Isamu spun around at the sound. For a moment, he was unable to comprehend what he was seeing. 2 months of work, his masterpiece, destroyed by a child's careless action. The rage that surged through him was immediate and overwhelming. His face flushed, his hands clenched, and he opened his mouth to unleash all the fury and devastation he felt. But then he saw his nephew's face. The child's eyes were welling up with tears, and his small body was frozen in terror. The boy looked at the ruined panel, then at his uncle, then back at the panel. "I'm sorry," the child whispered. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Something within Isamu broke in that moment, but it wasn't anger, it was something else. He looked at the terrified child, then at the panel, then back at the child, and suddenly the situation appeared entirely different. It was just a piece of wood. He had carved it skillfully, yes, but it was still just wood. It could be carved again. His nephew was a living child, already learning that mistakes lead to harsh punishment, already developing the fear and shame that would follow him through life if Isamu reacted with rage right now. Which was more important, the perfect panel or the child's trust, his reputation or his nephew's well-being, the outcome he had demanded, or the reality of the moment before him? Isamu took a long, deep breath, then another. He put down his tool and knelt so that he was at eye level with his nephew. "It's all right," he said quietly. The boy stared at him, disbelieving. "It's just wood," Isamu continued. "You didn't mean to damage it, and I should have been more careful about where I left sharp tools when a child was in the room." "But all your work," the nephew said, tears spilling over. "I can carve it again. I've learned the mountain now, and the second version will probably be better anyway." Isamu surprised himself by realizing that this was true. He had learned so much in creating the first panel that a second attempt would undoubtedly benefit from that experience. He stood and examined the damage. The gouge mark was deep and ugly, slicing through what had been the most beautiful section of the carving. There was no way to repair it. The panel was ruined. "You know what?" Somebody, "I've been carving for 30 years, and every single panel has been exactly as I planned. Perfect. Controlled. Maybe that's made my work a little stiff, a little lifeless. Let me try something different." Over the next few days, instead of starting over, Isamu worked with the damaged panel. He integrated the gouge mark into the design, transforming it into a lightning strike hitting the waterfall. He carved the wood around it to showcase the energy of the strike and the disruption it caused in the water's flow. The perfect, controlled landscape became something more dynamic, more alive. When the merchant came to view the finished work, he stood before it in silence for a long time. "This is not what I asked for," he finally said. Isamu's heart sank. Of course, the man had paid for a specific design and Isamu had failed to deliver it. "But it's far better," the merchant continued. "There's something in this piece that wasn't present in your other work. Life, movement, the unexpected. I'll pay you double." Isamu declined the extra payment, but he couldn't stop thinking about what the merchant had said. Something about that accident, that moment when his perfect plan was shattered, had compelled him to create differently, without the rigid attachment to his original vision. Something freer had emerged. Years later, Isamu's style had completely transformed. He still carved skillfully, but he no longer demanded absolute control over the outcome. He would allow the wood to guide him, following the grain rather than fighting against it. He would incorporate accidents rather than treating them as disasters. His work became known not for its precision, but for its vitality. When students asked him about his technique, he would tell them about the lightning strike panel, about his nephew's mistake, and about the moment he had to choose between his attachment to a perfect outcome and the reality of what was. "I used to think skill meant controlling everything," he would say. "Now I understand that true mastery lies in knowing when to guide and when to follow. The wood has its own nature, and life has its own flow. Fighting against that creates rigidity, while working with it creates something truly alive." Isamu's story reveals another facet of attachment. He wasn't clinging to an object, but to an outcome, to a vision of how things should be. His entire sense of self was wrapped up in creating perfect work according to his precise plans. When reality disrupted those plans, he faced a choice: fight with what had happened or work with it. The moment he chose not to shout at his nephew was the moment his attachment began to dissolve. In that space between the ruined panel and his response, he saw something clearly. His attachment to perfection was creating rigidity, not just in his work, but in his relationship with life itself. Notice what happened when he relinquished his demand that things be exactly as he had planned. He didn't become careless or cease striving to do good work. Instead, his work actually improved. The rigid control that stemmed from attachment had been limiting him. When he released that control, something more alive was able to emerge. This points to a paradox that runs through Zen teaching. The things we grip most tightly are often the things we damage through our gripping, and the outcomes we try hardest to force are often the ones that remain most elusive. Attachment creates a kind of desperate energy that prevents the natural unfolding of things. When we release attachment, we don't lose our connection to what we care about. We actually experience it more fully. Isamu didn't stop caring about his work when he stopped demanding perfect control. He began caring about it in a deeper, freer way. His work became an expression of engagement with reality rather than an attempt to force reality into a predetermined shape. Both Tenzo and Isamu demonstrate that letting go of attachment isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about loving things, working with things, and valuing things without needing them to be permanent or controllable. This open-handed way of living doesn't diminish our experience, it enhances it, removing the layer of fear and desperation that attachment always carries. As you settle into rest tonight, take a moment to notice what you might be holding too tightly, perhaps an idea about how things should be, a demand that something not change, or an insistence that reality be different than it is. Don't judge these attachments, but simply observe them, and in observing them, perhaps you can sense what it might be like to hold things just a little more gently. We spend a significant portion of our lives attempting to manage outcomes. We plan carefully, work diligently, arrange circumstances, and try to steer events in directions we believe they should go. This effort feels necessary, even virtuous. After all, aren't we supposed to take responsibility for our lives? However, there's a critical distinction between responding skillfully to what life presents and trying to control what life presents in the first place. One aligns with reality, while the other fights against it. And that fight, no matter how determined or well-intentioned, is often the root of our deepest frustrations. The truth is that much of what happens in life lies beyond our control. We don't control the weather, the economy, other people's choices, our own thoughts and feelings, aging, illness, or countless other forces that shape our daily experiences. We can influence some things within a limited scope, but control itself is largely an illusion we maintain through constant effort. Zen Buddhism doesn't advocate for passivity or suggest that we cease striving to do good in the world. Instead, it proposes something more nuanced. We can act with full commitment while holding our plans lightly. We can work toward desired outcomes without demanding that reality conform to our vision. We can do what we believe is right and then meet whatever unfolds with openness rather than resistance. This shift from controlling to responding transforms everything. When we're not exhausting ourselves trying to force outcomes, we have more energy to deal with what's actually before us. When we're not rigidly attached to how things should unfold, we can adapt when circumstances shift. When we cease fighting with reality, we can finally work in harmony with it. In the mountains north of Kyoto stood a monastery renowned for its peaceful atmosphere and simple way of life. The abbot of this monastery was a man named Daitsu, who had led the community for nearly 20 years. Daitsu managed the monastery with meticulous attention, maintaining a precise daily schedule. Morning meditation commenced at dawn, followed by work periods, study time, meals, and evening services, all at specific hours. He clearly defined the monks' responsibilities and planned the monastery's activities months in advance. Everything had its designated place, its proper time, and its expected form. The monks respected Daitsu's leadership, and the monastery functioned seamlessly. Visitors often remarked on the orderly beauty of the place, observing how everything seemed to flow effortlessly. Daitsu took great satisfaction in this, having created a harmonious environment through his careful management. One autumn morning, just as the monks were settling into their meditation, a stranger appeared at the monastery gate. He was a monk from a temple far to the south, a temple that had recently burned to the ground. He had been traveling for weeks, seeking temporary refuge while his community rebuilt. Behind him were 40 more monks from his temple, all exhausted and in need of shelter. The gatekeeper went to find Daitsu in the meditation hall, whispering the situation quietly. 40 unexpected guests with no warning and no preparation. Daitsu paused, considering the implications. The meditation schedule would need to be adjusted. The meals he had planned wouldn't suffice for so many, and the sleeping quarters were already occupied. His carefully laid arrangements would be disrupted in ways he hadn't foreseen. He stood and went to meet the travelers. They stood in the courtyard, travel-worn and uncertain. The leader bowed deeply. "Forgive this intrusion, Master Daitsu. We would not presume upon your hospitality were it not for our dire need. We've been walking for weeks, sleeping in forests and fields. If you could shelter us even for a few days while we make other arrangements." Daitsu considered the possibilities. He could direct them to another monastery, offer shelter to only a few, or explain that his community's routine couldn't easily accommodate such an interruption. Each thought arose in turn, each offering a way to maintain what he had carefully built. But then he looked at the monks' faces. They were exhausted. Their robes were dirty and torn, and some of them appeared ill. They had lost everything and had been walking for weeks. And here he was, worried about his meditation schedule. "Welcome," he heard himself say. "Please come in. You must be hungry." The next few hours unfolded unlike any day in recent memory. The kitchen monks adjusted their preparations for the larger group, and monks rearranged sleeping spaces, making room wherever they could. The meditation schedule gave way to more pressing needs. Everything Daitsu had meticulously structured transformed into something more fluid. He moved through the monastery, attending to the various needs that arose. A visiting monk needed medicine, the kitchen required more rice brought from storage, and someone's robe needed mending. Each situation called for a response he hadn't planned. By evening, Daitsu sat alone in his room, gazing at the schedule he had posted on the wall. None of it had been followed that day. Nothing had gone according to plan. His carefully structured monastery had become something different, something he hadn't intended. Your task is to rewrite the following paragraph, writing exactly as it is without adding any notes or annotations. The next morning, he woke before dawn as usual, intending to at least adhere to the meditation schedule. But as he walked toward the meditation hall, he heard something unexpected. Voices. Laughter. In the kitchen, the monastery's own monks joined the visitors in preparing breakfast. The air was filled with conversation as they exchanged stories from their respective monasteries, punctuated by shared laughter at jokes. The usually quiet kitchen was now vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to its typical daytime silence. Daisetsu observed similar transformations throughout the monastery. The assigned work periods evolved into collaborative efforts. The visiting monks, grateful for the shelter, contributed with palpable enthusiasm. They introduced Daitsu's monks to songs from their own tradition, different methods of preparing tea, various meditation techniques, and fresh perspectives on the teachings. The monastery was louder and less orderly than usual, and the regular schedule remained disrupted. However, an element that had previously been absent had taken root: a genuine sense of community, spontaneous and authentic, which the rigid structure had inadvertently stifled. That evening, Daisetsu sat with the visiting abbot on the monastery steps, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. "Thank you again for your hospitality," the visitor said. "I realize our arrival has disrupted your routine." Daitsu paused thoughtfully. "For 2 decades, I've meticulously cultivated a specific kind of order here. I believe that this order fostered harmony, but I now recognize it created more of a stillness. The past 2 days have been chaotic, yet there's more genuine life within these walls than I've witnessed in years." "Your monks are remarkably disciplined," the visitor observed. "That discipline is evident in all their actions." "Yes, they are disciplined. But I now question whether I've been using discipline to control something that doesn't require controlling. Life possesses its own innate order, its own natural flow. Perhaps I've been resisting that flow instead of trusting it." The visiting monk stayed for 2 weeks. During that time, Daitsu's carefully maintained schedule never fully recovered, and he found that he didn't desire it to. He began to perceive his previous approach as a form of fear disguised as leadership, where he tried to prevent anything unexpected from happening in order to keep everything predictable and manageable. When the visiting monks finally resumed their journey, the monastery did not revert to its former rigid structure. Instead, Daitsu established a lighter framework, providing enough organization for functionality, but not so much that it impeded natural adaptation. He learned to plan, but to hold those plans loosely. He discovered that his community was more capable of self-organization than he had given them credit for. Years later, monks who had experienced the monastery under both regimes would say that it had been utterly transformed. When asked to articulate the difference, they often struggled to find the right words. Finally, one elderly monk put it succinctly: "Before, we were very organized. Now, we're very alive." Daitsu's experience reveals a profound truth about the nature of control. His meticulous organization was not inherently wrong or malicious. It had, after all, created a functioning monastery. However, it had also fostered rigidity. His need to maintain predictability prevented the natural vibrancy of life from flowing freely through the community. When the unexpected visitors arrived, Daitsu faced a choice: either cling to control by sending them away or minimizing their disruption, or relinquish his need for things to go according to plan and embrace the situation as it was. Note that letting go did not mean doing nothing. It meant responding to the reality at hand rather than insisting on his preconceived plans. The chaos of those initial days was challenging for him. His entire identity was wrapped up in being the one who maintained order. Releasing that identity felt like losing himself. However, what emerged was something he couldn't have planned or controlled: a genuine community that arose naturally when he stopped trying to impose a specific form. The monastery became more alive precisely because he ceased trying to micromanage every aspect of its operation. This highlights a subtle aspect of control. When we grasp something too tightly, we often stifle its life force. When we insist that things must unfold in a particular way, we prevent the natural unfolding that might lead to something even better than we had envisioned. Control offers the illusion of safety, but it often comes at the expense of vitality. Control also manifests in another way, not in managing external circumstances, but in battling what has already transpired. In a village famed for its pottery, there lived a woman named Shizu who had dedicated her entire life to mastering her craft. She had trained under her mother and grandmother, both accomplished potters. By the age of 40, Shizu's work was highly sought after throughout the region. Her bowls and vases were celebrated for their simple elegance and flawless forms. Shizu approached her work with extraordinary care. She would spend days meticulously preparing the clay, ensuring that every stone and air bubble was removed. She would throw each piece multiple times until the walls achieved the precise thickness she desired. During firing, she would constantly monitor the kiln, making precise temperature adjustments, leaving nothing to chance. Her pottery studio was built adjacent to her house, and her kiln was housed in a small building behind it. She had designed the kiln herself, drawing upon the expertise of the most skilled kiln builders in the province. It was her pride and joy, built to her exact specifications, and it fired her pottery to perfection. One summer, the rainy season arrived early and persisted longer than usual. For weeks, torrential rains fell almost daily, saturating the ground. Small streams, usually clear, swelled and became muddy torrents. One night, Shizu was awakened by a deep rumbling sound. She rushed outside and saw, through the darkness and rain, that the hillside behind her studio had given way. A mudslide was cascading down, heading directly toward her kiln building. She watched helplessly as the mud engulfed the kiln, and the building collapsed under the weight of earth and water. When morning arrived and the rain finally ceased, her kiln lay buried under several feet of mud and debris, utterly destroyed. Shizu stood gazing at the devastation, feeling something within her collapse. She had invested years in building that kiln, years of planning, construction, and fine-tuning. It had been perfect, and now it was gone, along with her ability to fire her pottery. Without the kiln, she was unable to work, and her livelihood was buried beneath the mud. For days, she desperately tried to salvage something. She dug through the mud, hoping to find pieces of the kiln that could be salvaged. But the structure was irreparable. Even if she managed to remove all the mud, the kiln would need to be completely rebuilt. At first, her mind refused to accept this reality. She would awaken each morning, consumed by thoughts of how to undo what had already occurred. If only she had built the kiln in a different location. If only she had noticed the instability of the hillside. If only the rain hadn't come so early. Her thoughts circled endlessly around these if-onlys, as if dwelling on them enough might somehow alter the reality. One afternoon, a monk who occasionally visited the village saw Shizu sitting beside the destroyed kiln. He sat down near her without a word, and they remained together in silence for a long time. "It shouldn't have happened," Shizu finally said. "I was so careful. I planned everything. The kiln was perfect." "Yes," the monk replied. "It shouldn't have happened according to your plans, but it did happen according to rain and mud and gravity. I can't accept this. Everything I built is gone. Not accepting it doesn't change it," the monk said gently. "The kiln is destroyed whether you accept it or not. The question is whether you'll spend your energy fighting with what's already happened, or whether you'll use that energy to respond to what is." Shizu felt anger rising. "So I'm just supposed to be happy about this?" "Not happy, but perhaps not at war with reality. Right now, you're exhausting yourself trying to mentally undo what cannot be undone. That energy could be channeled into building something new." Over the following weeks, Shizu recognized the truth in the monk's words. She would catch herself spending hours replaying the disaster, wishing it hadn't happened, imagining how things would be if it hadn't. None of this changed anything. The kiln remained destroyed, but her resistance to that reality was destroying something else, her capacity to respond. One morning, she awoke with a different thought. The kiln was gone. That was simply true. What now? She went to visit another potter in a neighboring village. This woman possessed a kiln and agreed to let Shizu use it for a small fee. This meant traveling an hour each way to fire her work, a considerable inconvenience. Moreover, the other potter's kiln fired differently than Shizu's had, requiring adjustments to her techniques. However, as she worked within these new constraints, something unexpected occurred. The altered firing temperatures produced effects in the glazes that she had never before achieved. Some pieces that she had thought were ruined emerged from the kiln with surprising beauty. The inconvenience of traveling forced her to work more efficiently, leading her to make better decisions about which pieces were worth firing. After several months, Shizu had saved enough money to begin rebuilding, but she hesitated. The enforced changes in her process had revealed possibilities she hadn't known existed. Did she want to rebuild the exact same kiln or explore something different? She decided to build a smaller kiln closer to the village, one that other potters could also use. She incorporated design elements from her old kiln as well as from the one she had been borrowing. The new kiln was different and, in some ways, superior to what she had lost. A year after the mudslide, a merchant who had long been familiar with Shizu's work came to purchase pieces for a shop in the capital. He examined her recent pottery with surprise. "Something has changed in your work," he said. "It's still distinctly yours, but there's a quality it didn't possess before. More freedom, perhaps, less perfection, but more life." Shizu understood what he meant. The disaster had compelled her to loosen her grip on her process. The loss of control had unveiled possibilities that her need for control had obscured. "I lost something precious," she told the merchant, "and I spent a long time fighting with that loss, trying to undo it in my mind. When I finally stopped fighting and simply responded to what was real, I discovered that what seemed like an ending was also a beginning." Years later, younger potters would come to study with Shizu. They admired her skill, but also her attitude. When their own pieces cracked in the kiln or their plans went awry, she would recount the story of the mudslide, the destroyed kiln, and the weeks she had wasted fighting with what had already happened. "Things will go wrong," she would say. "That's not a failure of planning or skill. That's simply how life works. Rain falls, mudslides happen, kilns break. The question isn't how to prevent these things, but how quickly you can stop fighting with what's already happened and start working with what is." Shizu's story illustrates the exhausting futility of battling what's already done. The mudslide had happened, and the kiln was destroyed. These were simply facts. Yet, she spent weeks trying to mentally undo those facts, as if her thoughts could somehow rewind time and prevent what had occurred. This is a common human tendency. Something goes wrong, and we replay it endlessly. If only I had done things differently. It shouldn't have happened this way. Why did this happen to me? These thoughts accomplish nothing except to trap us in a battle with an unchangeable reality. The monk's question gets to the crux of the matter. Are you using your energy to fight what has already happened or to respond to what is? One is utterly futile. The other is the only way to move forward. Note that accepting what happened didn't mean Shizu liked or approved of it. It meant she acknowledged a simple truth: the kiln was destroyed. From that acknowledgement, she could begin to respond. As long as she resisted the reality of the loss, all her energy was consumed in that fruitless battle. Once she accepted it, that energy became available for building what came next. The unexpected benefits that arose from the disaster, the new techniques, the different kiln design, the enhanced vitality in her work, became visible only once she ceased insisting that things should have unfolded according to her plans. Life had presented her with something unwanted and uncontrollable. Yet, within that unwanted circumstance lay possibilities that she couldn't have envisioned while she was busy demanding that reality be different. Both Daitsu and Shizu reveal the same truth from different perspectives. Control is largely an illusion that we maintain through constant effort. When that illusion is shattered by unexpected visitors, a mudslide, or any of the myriad ways life refuses to conform to our plans, we have a choice: either exhaust ourselves trying to reimpose control or learn to respond with flexibility to what is actually happening. This doesn't mean abandoning planning or effort. Daitsu continued to manage his monastery, and Shizu continued to create her pottery with care and skill. But they learned to hold their plans lightly, to work with circumstances rather than demanding that circumstances align with their will. A sense of ease arises from this recognition. When we're not constantly at war with reality, we have more energy to engage with it. When we stop trying to control the uncontrollable, we can focus on responding skillfully to what we can influence. The difference between these two approaches is the difference between exhaustion and vitality, between rigidity and aliveness. As you rest tonight, consider where you might be trying to control the uncontrollable. Perhaps you've been battling something that's already happened, attempting to mentally undo it. Perhaps you've been demanding that circumstances align with your plans instead of responding to circumstances as they are. There's no need to judge this impulse toward control. It stems from a natural desire for safety and predictability. Simply observe it and sense what it might be like to release it, even just a little, to cease fighting and begin flowing with what is. We constantly measure ourselves against others, evaluating our worth, determining if we're good enough, assessing if we're ahead or behind, better or worse, succeeding or failing. The mind ceaselessly generates these judgments, creating an endless scorecard of our standing. This comparing and judging feels natural, even necessary. How else would we know if we're on the right track? How else would we improve? But Zen Buddhism suggests that this constant measuring is a primary source of our unease. When we're always evaluating, we're never simply present. When we're always comparing, we're never at peace with what is. These judgments cut both ways. Sometimes we measure ourselves against others and find ourselves lacking. We see someone more talented, more successful, more at ease, and we feel inadequate. At other times, we measure ourselves as superior, but this brings its own subtle anxiety. We must maintain that position, protect it, and prove it again and again. In either case, the comparing mind keeps us in a state of tension. We can't rest because there's always another measurement to take, another comparison to check. Are we still ahead? Are we falling behind? The questions never cease, and they prevent us from experiencing life directly. We also judge our own experiences. This emotion is acceptable, that one is not. This thought is good, that one is bad. We categorize our inner life into right and wrong, wanted and unwanted, then expend energy trying to cultivate only the acceptable experiences and avoid the unacceptable ones. But Zen teaching points to a different path. What if we didn't need to constantly measure and evaluate? What if we could experience life without sorting everything into categories of better and worse? This doesn't mean abandoning discernment or ceasing to make practical choices. It means ceasing to exhaust ourselves with constant judgment. In a monastery famed for teaching calligraphy, two young monks arrived in the same season to begin their training. Their names were Goro and Ren, and from the beginning it was clear that they possessed vastly different abilities. Goro possessed a natural gift for brushwork. When he held the brush, his hands seemed to instinctively know how to move. His characters displayed grace and balance from the outset. The teacher would demonstrate a stroke once, and Goro could replicate it perfectly. Other students would gather to watch him practice, admiring the effortless ease with which he worked. Ren struggled with everything. His hand was stiff, and his characters were awkward and unbalanced. He would practice the same stroke hundreds of times and still fail to achieve the form that the teacher had demonstrated. Where Goro's work appeared effortless, Ren's displayed the strain of intense effort. The teacher, an old monk named Kosho, treated both students with equal attention. He corrected Goro's work when necessary and encouraged Ren through his struggles. However, the other students began to whisper, "Why does the teacher devote so much time to Ren when he clearly has no talent? Why waste instruction on someone who will never become skilled?" Goro himself wondered about this. He would finish his practice quickly, his work appearing polished and refined, then watch Ren labor over the same exercises for hours, producing characters that still looked clumsy despite all the effort. It seemed obvious that Goro was the superior student, the one who deserved more of the teacher's attention. One day, after morning practice, Kosho asked both students to stay behind. He placed two scrolls on the table, one from each of them. "Tell me, Goro," Kosho said, "what do you see when you look at your work?" Goro examined his scroll. The characters were beautiful, well-formed, and balanced. "I see good calligraphy," he said simply. "And what did you learn in creating it?" Goro paused. He hadn't really thought about it. The work had come easily, almost automatically. "I learned the correct form of the characters," he said finally. Kosho nodded and turned to Ren. "And you? What do you see in your work?" Ren looked at his scroll with visible disappointment. "I see clumsy characters. I see where my hand moved too quickly here, where I pressed too hard there, where I lost focus and the stroke went crooked. And what did you learn?" "I learned that when I breathe steadily, my hand is less stiff. I learned that if I watch the ink flow onto the paper, I can feel when I'm forcing the stroke. I learned that my impatience makes the brush wobble. And when I accept that the character takes as long as it takes, the line becomes smoother." Kosho remained quiet for a moment, looking at both scrolls. Goro's calligraphy is more beautiful. Anyone can see that. But Ren is learning calligraphy. Goro is simply doing what comes naturally. Goro felt something shift uncomfortably within him. But isn't the point to create beautiful characters? The point is to understand the way through the brush. Beautiful characters are one result, but not the only one. Ren is developing awareness through struggle. He's learning to feel the connection between his breath, his attention, and his hand. You create beauty without effort, which is a gift. But Ren is learning something deeper. Over the following months, Goro began to observe Ren's practice differently. He noticed how focused Ren became, how completely present to each stroke. When Ren made a mistake, he would pause and examine it carefully, trying to understand exactly what had happened. When a character came out better than before, he would note what had been different in his approach. Goro realized that his own practice had become mechanical. Because the work came easily, he rarely paid deep attention to it. He would complete his exercises while his mind wandered to other things. The beauty of his calligraphy was effortless, but he was learning very little. He began to practice differently, bringing the same careful attention that Ren brought naturally through necessity. He slowed down, paid attention to his breath, his posture, the feeling of the brush in his hand, and his calligraphy became even more refined. But more importantly, he began to understand what Kosho had been teaching. Years passed. Goro's work remained technically superior, his characters more beautiful by conventional standards, but Ren's calligraphy had developed a quality that was harder to define. Each character displayed the presence of the person creating it. The strokes possessed life, evidence of full attention and genuine engagement. When students would ask Kosho about the difference between natural talent and dedicated practice, he would sometimes show them scrolls from both monks without revealing which was which. This one, he would say, pointing to Goro's work, shows mastery of technique, and this one, pointing to Ren's, shows mastery of self. Both have value, but only one came through the kind of attention that transforms a person. Goro and Ren became friends over the years, each appreciating what the other brought to the practice. Goro no longer measured his worth by how easily beautiful calligraphy came to him. Ren no longer judged his struggle as evidence of failure. They had both learned that the comparing mind, which creates hierarchies of better and worse, more talented and less talented, misses something essential about the nature of true learning. When they eventually became teachers themselves, they would tell their own students, "Don't compare your practice to anyone else's. Your path is your own. What looks like advantage might be an obstacle. What looks like an obstacle might be the very thing that opens understanding." The story of Goro and Ren illustrates how misleading our measurements can be. By every obvious standard, Goro was the better calligrapher. His work was more beautiful, and his technique was more polished. If we were judging purely by results, Goro was clearly superior, but that judgment missed what was actually happening. Ren's struggle was forcing him to pay attention in ways that Goro's easy success never demanded. Ren was developing a quality of presence that would ultimately make his work profound despite its technical imperfections. Goro's gift was real, but it was also allowing him to remain superficial in his practice. This highlights something important about comparison. When we measure ourselves against others, we're usually comparing surfaces. We see the results, the external markers of success or failure, but we don't see the inner development, the quality of attention, the depth of engagement. These things are invisible to casual observation, but they're often what matters most. Notice, too, that the comparing created suffering for both monks. Goro felt superior, which prevented him from learning deeply. Ren felt inferior, which made his genuine progress feel like failure. Both were trapped in a story about better and worse that obscured what was actually true. When Kosho pointed out what was really happening, both monks could begin to see beyond their judgments. Goro could appreciate the depth that struggle can bring. Ren could recognize that his difficulty was teaching him something valuable. The comparing mind fell away, and they could both simply engage with their practice as it was. Comparison also creates suffering in another way. Sometimes we measure ourselves not against distant others, but against people in our immediate world, people whose presence reminds us daily of what we think we lack. In a village known for its fine textiles, there lived two weavers whose homes stood side by side. One was named Kyo, the other Hana. They had grown up together, learned weaving from the same teacher, and opened their workshops at nearly the same time. For years, they worked alongside each other in friendly companionship. They would share tea in the afternoons, discuss techniques, and show each other their work. They began developing entirely new weaving patterns. Each woman deeply respected the other's skill, and their collaboration was free of any sense of rivalry or tension. One day, a merchant from the capital visited the village, seeking fine textiles for the city markets. He toured both workshops, carefully examining the quality and artistry of their work. Ultimately, he placed a significant order with Hana, explaining that her patterns possessed a level of sophistication that would greatly appeal to the capital's affluent clientele. He did not place any order with Chio. Chio told herself she was genuinely happy for her friend's success, and a part of her truly was. However, another part of her began to notice things she had previously overlooked or dismissed. Hana's workshop, she realized, was slightly larger and better equipped than hers. Hana's loom was newer and more advanced. When potential customers passed through the village, they seemed to gravitate towards Hana's shop, often spending more time browsing there. Almost unconsciously, she started comparing her own work to Hana's in ways she never had before. When she looked at her own weavings, she now saw flaws she hadn't noticed previously. The colors seemed dull and muted next to Hana's vibrant and expertly applied dyes. The patterns now appeared simpler, somehow less intriguing and original. She found herself constantly questioning why her work wasn't as good, wondering what she was doing wrong, and of course, why the merchant hadn't chosen her. These thoughts, once initiated, began to consume her. She would lie awake at night, her mind racing with these comparisons and anxieties. She even started watching Hana's workshop from her window, meticulously noting when customers entered and wondering what they were purchasing. She began to feel a growing sense of resentment whenever Hana mentioned a new commission or proudly displayed a piece she was particularly pleased with. The warm friendship between them began to erode. Chio became distant and withdrawn, often inventing excuses to avoid their regular afternoon tea gatherings. When they did happen to talk, Chio felt a distinct tightness in her chest, a deeply uncomfortable blend of envy and shame. She knew her feelings were ungenerous and unfair, yet she seemed utterly powerless to stop the constant, corrosive comparisons. Her own weaving work began to suffer noticeably. Instead of experiencing the joy and satisfaction she had always felt while creating, she found herself endlessly evaluating each piece against what she imagined Hana was capable of producing. Nothing ever seemed good enough. She would start a pattern with enthusiasm only to abandon it midway, convinced it lacked the sophistication, beauty, or value to compete. One day, an old woman came to the village, selling herbs and traditional medicines. She stopped at Chio's workshop and asked to see her textiles. Chio listlessly showed her a few pieces, half-heartedly assuming the woman couldn't afford anything of real value. The old woman examined the work with unexpected care, running her calloused hands over the fabric, holding it up to the light to study its texture and weave. "This is remarkable," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. "Look at the evenness of your weave, the way you've skillfully blended these colors. There's real skill and dedication here." Chio felt tears welling up unexpectedly in her eyes. When was the last time anyone had offered her such sincere and positive feedback about her work? But even as the woman praised her, Chio's mind was already reverting to its default setting: comparison. Hana's work, she thought, would undoubtedly be even more remarkable to this perceptive woman. Hana's skill was, in her mind, inherently greater. "You don't believe me, do you?" the old woman observed, her gaze sharp and knowing. "You're thinking your neighbor is a more skilled weaver. I haven't seen your neighbor's work. I'm looking at yours," Chio countered weakly, "but hers is better. Everyone knows that." A merchant from the capital chose her work, not mine. The old woman gently set down the textile she was holding. "And so you've decided your work has no value?" "It has less value," Chio insisted. "That's just the truth." "Is it?" the old woman countered softly. "Or is that a story you're telling yourself? A story you've come to believe?" The old woman moved to the window, gazing out at the tranquil village scene. "I've lived a long time, child. I've seen countless skilled craftspeople, many talented artists, and I've observed a recurring pattern. The ones who dissipate their energy constantly comparing themselves to others rarely achieve their full potential. They are far too preoccupied with measuring themselves to actually create something truly unique. But how can I not compare? Chio exclaimed, her voice tinged with desperation. She's right there, working beside me, creating things that are undeniably more beautiful than what I can create. You're not truly looking at her work, the old woman corrected gently. You're looking at your idea of her work, an idealized, probably unrealistic version. You're imagining it's perfect, flawlessly executed, while you automatically assume yours is inherently flawed. But I'd wager that if you looked honestly without the filter of comparison, you'd see that both of you have individual strengths and corresponding weaknesses. You've simply decided that her strengths are somehow superior and that your weaknesses are insurmountable. The old woman picked up another piece of Chio's weaving. This piece, she said, holding it up, possesses a simplicity that is deeply appealing. The pattern is clear, uncluttered, and restful. Some people are drawn to sophistication and complexity, intricate designs that challenge the eye, but others, perhaps just as many, want something that feels calm, honest, and unpretentious. Different doesn't automatically equate to worse, child. It simply means different. After the old woman departed, Chio remained seated in her workshop for a long time, lost in contemplation. She looked at her textiles, really looked at them, consciously trying to see them without immediately comparing them to Hana's work. It proved to be far more difficult than she had anticipated. Her mind, seemingly of its own accord, wanted to jump immediately to judgment, to measurement, to the familiar, well-worn narrative about whose work was inherently superior. But when she finally managed to simply see her own weaving, without the distraction of comparison, she began to notice qualities she had previously been overlooking. There was a palpable sense of care evident in her work, a steadiness of hand, a kind of quiet, understated beauty that she had stopped appreciating simply because it wasn't the same as the bold, attention-grabbing beauty of Hana's pieces. Over the following weeks, Chio consciously tried to catch herself whenever the impulse to compare began to arise. It happened dozens of times each day, a deeply ingrained habit. She would glance at Hana's shop and immediately wonder if Hana was receiving more customers than she was. She would finish a piece of weaving and immediately imagine it placed next to Hana's work, inevitably finding it lacking in some way. Each time she made a concerted effort to acknowledge the thought without judgment, and then consciously let it pass, gently returning her attention to her own work, to the act of creating in that very moment. It was incredibly difficult, a constant uphill battle. The habit of comparing was so deeply entrenched in her mind that it felt almost automatic. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift within her. She began to rediscover the simple pleasure of weaving, not because she had somehow convinced herself that her work was better than Hana's, but because she had finally stopped asking that destructive question altogether. Her textiles were what they were, a reflection of her own unique skill and artistic vision. Hana's were equally valid, equally worthy of appreciation. Both could be true, both could coexist, without one in any way diminishing the other. One afternoon, Chio saw Hana working in her garden and felt a sudden, almost irresistible impulse, one she had been actively avoiding for months. She walked over to Hana and tentatively asked if she would like to share tea together, just as they used to do before the insidious cloud of comparison had poisoned their friendship. Hana's face brightened immediately with genuine delight. "I'd love that, Chio. I've truly missed our talks." They sat together in Hana's garden, and Chio found that the familiar tightness she had been feeling in Hana's presence had miraculously eased. She could listen to Hana describe her recent commissions without feeling that sharp stab of envy. She could show Hana her own work without succumbing to the painful, automatic comparison. They were simply two weavers again, sharing their craft, each pursuing her own unique artistic path. Years later, both women became renowned throughout the entire region for their distinctive textiles. Hana's work was highly prized for its intricate complexity, its bold colors, and its innovative designs. Chio's weavings, in contrast, became valued for their understated elegance, their clarity of pattern, and their sense of peaceful restraint. Different merchants sought them out for entirely different reasons, each appealing to a distinct clientele. Both women had thriving workshops, full of activity and satisfied customers who appreciated their unique contributions to the art of weaving. When younger weavers would occasionally seek Chiyo's advice, she would often tell them, learn from others, certainly. Appreciate skill and artistry wherever you find it, but never ever measure your own work against anyone else's. The comparing mind will inevitably steal your joy, stifle your creativity, and ultimately limit your growth. Simply make what is yours to make, pour your heart and soul into your craft, and let that be enough. Trust that your unique vision has inherent value. Chios' experience serves as a powerful illustration of just how poisonous comparison can become when we allow it to take root in our minds. What began as a simple observation, the objective fact that the merchant had chosen Hana's work over hers, gradually spiraled into a consuming preoccupation, an all-encompassing obsession. Every interaction with Hana, every thought about her own work became filtered through the distorting lens of who was better, who had more success, whose work was more valued by the outside world. This constant comparing didn't help Chio improve her skills or motivate her to develop her artistic vision. Instead, it effectively paralyzed her creativity, stifled her inspiration, and severely damaged a genuine and valuable friendship. She lost the ability to see her own work clearly, to appreciate its unique qualities, because she was always viewing it through the distorting lens of comparison, endlessly measuring it against an often imagined ideal. Consider what happened when the old woman simply looked at Chio's weaving without comparing it to anything else. She was able to discern its actual qualities, the skill and dedication that were genuinely present, the quiet beauty that Chio herself had overlooked. Chio had lost the ability to see these things, not because they weren't there, but because she had allowed comparison to become her primary mode of perception, her habitual way of viewing the world. The process of releasing herself from the grip of comparison wasn't easy for Chio. It required constant vigilance, consciously catching the destructive habit as it arose, and returning again and again to the simple act of seeing what was directly in front of her, without judgment or preconceived notions. But as that insidious habit gradually loosened its grip, she was finally able to return to the direct, unfiltered experience of her craft. She could weave simply for the joy of weaving, for the creative expression it allowed, rather than to prove something to herself or to achieve some arbitrary ranking in an imaginary competition. Both of these stories point to the same profound understanding. The comparing mind creates a false world of hierarchies and measurements, a distorted reality that obscures the true, inherent value of each person's unique path. When we're trapped in the cycle of comparison, we inevitably lose the ability to see clearly. We can't appreciate what's genuinely present, what's beautiful and valuable in its own right, because we're too busy measuring it against some external, often unattainable standard. This doesn't mean that we somehow lose the ability to discern quality or to learn from those who are more skilled or experienced than we are. It simply means that we stop using comparison as a tool to determine our own worth, to define our identity, or to understand our individual experience. We can recognize that someone else is exceptionally skilled without allowing that recognition to morph into a harsh judgment about our own value or abilities. We can appreciate different strengths and talents without creating an artificial ranking of better and worse. When the comparing mind finally quiets down, what remains is something far simpler, far more profound. Just this work, this moment, this particular expression of effort, skill, and dedicated attention. Not better or worse than anyone else's, simply what it is, a unique and valid creation. And in that state of simple, unadorned seeing, we often discover a sense of peace, a sense of contentment that all our relentless measuring and judging could never provide. As you settle into rest tonight, you might take a moment to notice the comparing mind at work. How many judgments have you made today, either about yourself or about others? How much precious energy went into measuring, evaluating, and ranking? This isn't about judging the judging, about feeling guilty for having these thoughts. It's simply about seeing them, acknowledging them, and feeling what it might be like to gently let go of some of those relentless measurements. To rest, even for a few moments, in the simple truth of who you are, without any need to rank it, label it, or compare it to anything else. There's a particular kind of suffering, a particularly insidious form of pain that we create entirely by ourselves, often without even realizing we're doing it. Someone hurts us, treats us unfairly, betrays our trust, or disappoints us deeply. That initial pain, the immediate sting of the event, is real and natural, an unavoidable part of life. But then something else often happens. We begin to carry that initial hurt with us, replaying it endlessly in our minds, nurturing it, keeping it alive long after the original event has faded into the past. This is the essence of resentment, the quiet poison that slowly eats away at our well being. It's the decision, often unconscious, to hold on to pain, to refuse to let go. We tell ourselves we're protecting ourselves, that our anger is justified, that the other person deserves our ongoing disapproval and condemnation. And all of this may be true, at least in some limited sense. But the simple truth is that the person who suffers most from our resentment is invariably ourselves. The other person, often blissfully unaware of the turmoil within us, goes about their life, often completely oblivious to the anger we're carrying towards them. They sleep peacefully, while we lie awake at night, replaying old conversations, obsessing over past injustices. They enjoy their days, while we actively sabotage our own happiness by dwelling on bitter thoughts and resentful feelings. We mistakenly believe that our resentment is primarily aimed at them, a weapon we're using to punish them. But in reality, it's a poison that we're drinking ourselves, slowly poisoning our own minds, bodies, and spirits. Zen Buddhism offers a simple yet profoundly insightful question. Who is this resentment actually hurting? Not in theory, not in some abstract sense, but actually right now, in this very moment, who is feeling the effects of this anger? And when we answer honestly, without self-deception, we see that it is we who are bearing the weight, feeling the bitterness, losing sleep, and carrying the heavy burden of resentment. This recognition doesn't come from a sense of shoulds, from some external moral imperative. It's not that we should forgive or that we should let go, simply because that's the right thing to do. It's far simpler, far more direct than that. We see with undeniable clarity that resentment is a fire that we're holding in our own hands, and that holding it is causing us pain. Letting go of resentment isn't about the other person at all. It's not somehow excusing their behavior or saying that what they did was acceptable. It's not pretending we weren't hurt or denying the validity of our feelings. It's simply making the conscious choice to put down a weight that we no longer want to carry, to release ourselves from the burden of anger. It's choosing our own peace of mind, our own emotional well-being, over the strange, self-destructive satisfaction of clinging to anger. In a small, close-knit farming village, there lived two brothers named Kenji and Hiro. They had grown up together, worked the family land side by side, and lived in neighboring houses, their lives intimately intertwined. For many years, they were exceptionally close, always helping each other with the demanding work of the harvests, sharing tools and resources, and celebrating festivals together with their families, their bond seemingly unbreakable. Their father, upon his death, had left them the family land equally, making it clear that both sons should continue to work it together as a team and fairly share the yield of their combined efforts. For several years, this harmonious arrangement worked perfectly. They would decide together what crops to plant each season, work the fields side by side with a shared sense of purpose, and divide the harvest fairly, according to their father's wishes. Then came a year of particularly poor rains, a year of drought and hardship. The crops suffered significantly, and the resulting harvest was far smaller than usual, a fraction of what they had come to expect. When it came time to divide the meager harvest, a serious disagreement arose between the brothers, fueled by stress and anxiety over their uncertain future. Kenji firmly believed that he had worked more hours that year, putting in extra effort to compensate for the fact that Hiro had been sick for a portion of the growing season. He felt, therefore, that he deserved a slightly larger share of the harvest to fairly reflect his extra labor and dedication. Hiro, however, equally adamant, pointed out that he had contributed more seed from his own personal stores when they were running critically short, and that his tools had been used almost exclusively for the majority of the work. Each brother genuinely felt that his own contribution had been greater, more significant, and more valuable than the others. The initial discussion, meant to be a reasonable negotiation, quickly became heated and acrimonious. Words were exchanged, harsh words that hadn't been meant, or perhaps had been meant, but should never have been spoken aloud. Kenji, in the heat of the moment, accused Hiro of being lazy and of shirking his responsibilities. Hiro, equally hurt and defensive, called Kenji selfish and ungrateful, suggesting he was only concerned with his own well-being. They divided the harvest roughly in half, a superficial solution that satisfied no one, and parted in anger and bitter resentment, their long-standing bond fractured. That might have been the end of it, a temporary setback, an unpleasant but ultimately forgivable argument between brothers. But Kenji, unable to let go of his perceived injustice, couldn't bring himself to move on. He replayed the contentious conversation endlessly in his mind, meticulously thinking of better, more persuasive things he should have said, opportunities he had missed to defend his position. He began to obsessively watch Hiro's house, noting every time his brother seemed to be relaxing or taking a break instead of working, further fueling his sense of resentment. He actively collected evidence in his mind, compiling a detailed list of every time Hiro had been inconsiderate, unfair, or ungrateful, reaching back years for examples to bolster his case. When neighbors came to visit, Kenji would subtly and not so subtly find ways to steer the conversation towards the ongoing disagreement, always carefully painting himself as the wronged party, the victim of his brother's selfishness. He stopped attending village gatherings and social events if he knew Hiro would be present, actively avoiding any contact with his brother. He even instructed his own family, his wife and children, not to speak to Hiro's family, creating a deep and painful rift within their extended family. What had initially been a single, relatively minor argument gradually grew in Kenji's mind into a fundamental betrayal, a deep and unforgivable offense that threatened to destroy their relationship permanently. Years passed in this manner, marked by cold silence and simmering resentment. The brothers continued to work separate sections of the family land, meticulously avoiding each other, never speaking, never even acknowledging each other's presence, even when they happened to pass on the narrow village road. Kenji's resentment had become an integral part of his daily life, as familiar and ingrained as his morning routine. He thought about the perceived injustice regularly, almost obsessively, felt the anger rising within him, and mentally rehearsed what he would say if Hiro ever finally apologized, a scenario he secretly longed for. But Hiro never apologized. In fact, Hiro seemed to go about his life normally, seemingly unaffected by the ongoing feud. He continued to work his fields diligently, spent quality time with his family, and actively participated in village life, seemingly without a care in the world. Sometimes, Kenji would catch a glimpse of him laughing with neighbors, sharing a joke, and the sight would make Kenji's anger flare even hotter, burning with renewed intensity. How could Hiro possibly be happy? How could he find any joy in life when he had so blatantly wronged his own brother? One spring, a traveling monk named Daiki, known for his wisdom and compassion, stopped in the village. He was making a pilgrimage from temple to temple, walking from place to place, and simply needed a quiet place to rest and meditate for a few days. Kenji, eager for some company after having effectively isolated himself from much of the village, offered him shelter in his home. They sat together in the evenings, sharing simple meals, and Kenji, feeling a desperate need to unburden himself, found himself telling the monk the entire story of his strained relationship with his brother, about the original argument over the harvest, and about the perceived unfairness of it all, pouring out his pent-up resentment. The monk listened patiently and quietly, not interrupting, simply offering a compassionate presence. So, you see, Kenji concluded, his voice heavy with bitterness, I have every good reason to be angry. What he did was simply wrong. Perhaps it was, the monk acknowledged calmly. But tell me, how is your life these days? How are you faring? What do you mean? Kenji asked, puzzled by the seemingly irrelevant question. Are you happy, Kenji? Do you sleep well at night? Do you genuinely enjoy your work in the fields? Kenji paused, taken aback by the directness of the monk's questions. Now that he thought about it honestly, he realized that he wasn't happy at all. He often lay awake at night, his mind racing with thoughts of Hiro, replaying the old argument over and over. His work in the fields, once a source of pride and satisfaction, now felt lonely and bitter, tainted by his unresolved resentment. He had effectively distanced himself from his friends and neighbors, choosing isolation over connection, all because of his consuming anger. Even his time with his own family, his wife and children, was colored by his bitterness, preventing him from fully enjoying their company. Not particularly, he admitted quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. And your brother, how does he seem to be doing? The monk inquired gently. He seems fine, Kenji replied, his voice laced with barely concealed bitterness. That's what makes it even worse. He wronged me, and yet he seems perfectly fine, perfectly content. The monk remained silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. So he wronged you once, several years ago, and since that time you've been punishing yourself daily by carrying this anger towards him. Does that strike you as particularly wise, Kenji? I'm not punishing myself, Kenji protested defensively. I'm holding him accountable for his actions. He needs to understand the consequences of what he did. Are you truly holding him accountable? The monk countered softly. Does he actually feel held accountable, or does he simply go about his life, perhaps not even thinking about you, while you sit here alone, consumed by anger, unable to sleep peacefully, and separated from your community? Kenji wanted to argue to defend his position, but he found himself unable to articulate a coherent response. What the monk said was uncomfortably true, a painful mirror reflecting his own self-inflicted suffering. His resentment towards Hiro wasn't actually affecting Hiro at all. It was only affecting himself, poisoning his own life and stealing his joy. But I can't just forget what he did, Kenji insisted, his voice laced with desperation. I can't simply pretend that it never happened. I'm not suggesting that you forget, Kenji. I'm not asking you to deny your feelings or to excuse his actions, the monk clarified patiently. I'm simply asking you to consider whether you truly want to continue carrying this heavy weight, this burden of resentment, for the rest of your life. Not because Hiro somehow deserves your forgiveness, but because you deserve to be free from this constant anger. You deserve to experience peace and contentment. Over the next few days, Kenji pondered deeply on the monk's words, turning them over and over in his mind. He began to consciously notice just how often his thoughts turned to Hiro, to the old argument, to his meticulously compiled list of grievances, recognizing the obsessive nature of his resentment. He saw with growing clarity just how much precious energy he was expending on this self-destructive anger, energy that could have been channeled into enjoying his work, cherishing his family, and fully experiencing the richness of life. He finally realized something deeply uncomfortable, a profound truth that he had been actively avoiding for years. The original argument with Hiro had lasted at most an hour, a brief moment of conflict. But he had been replaying that argument in his mind, reliving the pain and anger every single day for years, effectively prolonging his own suffering. Hiro had hurt him once in a fleeting moment of anger. But Kenji had been hurting himself thousands of times since, reliving the pain endlessly, perpetuating his own misery. One morning, Kenji woke up and made a conscious decision. He didn't want to carry this burden anymore. Not because Hiro deserved his forgiveness, but because he himself deserved to be free from this constant corrosive anger. He deserved to experience peace. He walked to Hiro's house, his heart pounding with a mixture of trepidation and hope. His brother saw him approaching and stood in the doorway, his expression uncertain, guarded. I came to say, I'm done with this, Kenji said, his voice surprisingly steady. The argument we had, the anger between us, the years of silence, I'm done carrying it. I can't do it anymore. Hiro remained quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching Kenji's face. I've wanted to speak to you many times over the years, Kenji, he finally said, his voice soft. I know that I was wrong in some of what I said that day. I was angry, and I spoke harshly, saying things that I deeply regret. I was wrong too, Hiro, Kenji admitted, his voice filled with genuine remorse. But more than that, I was wrong to hold on to it for so long, to let that anger consume me. I've wasted years on this, years that I can never get back. They didn't fall into each other's arms like long-lost brothers in a sentimental story. The reunion was quiet, understated, and somewhat awkward, marked by a hesitant tenderness. The years of separation and unspoken resentment couldn't be undone in a single moment. But something profound had undeniably changed. The heavy weight that Kenji had been carrying for so long, the burden of anger and resentment, was finally gone, lifted from his shoulders. In the weeks that followed, Kenji began to notice the subtle but significant differences in his life. He slept better, his nights no longer haunted by replays of old arguments. His work in the fields felt lighter, infused with a renewed sense of purpose. He rejoined village gatherings, reconnecting with friends and neighbors he had long avoided. He smiled more easily, his face radiating a warmth and openness that had been missing for years. His family commented that he seemed more present, more himself, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. His relationship with Hiro slowly began to rebuild over time, brick by brick, with patience and understanding. It never fully went back to exactly what it had been before the devastating argument, but it became something real and genuine again, built on a foundation of mutual respect and forgiveness. They would help each other during busy seasons, sharing the demanding tasks. They would share a meal occasionally, laughing and reminiscing about old times. They were brothers again, imperfectly perhaps, but genuinely connected by a bond that had weathered a long and difficult storm. Years later, when Kenji was an old man, respected for his wisdom and kindness, younger villagers would sometimes seek his advice about conflicts, grudges, and broken relationships. He would often tell them the story of the years he had spent consumed by anger towards his brother, a period of self-imposed suffering that he deeply regretted. "I thought I was punishing him," he would say, his voice filled with hard-earned wisdom, "but I was only punishing myself. The day I finally let go of that resentment, the day I released myself from the prison of anger, was the day I got my life back. Not because Hiro deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved peace." Kenji's story illuminates a common pattern, something we all do in smaller or larger ways throughout our lives. Someone hurts us, betrays our trust, or treats us unfairly, and instead of feeling the hurt, processing it, and allowing it to naturally pass, we cling to it, nurturing the pain and allowing it to fester. We keep the wound fresh by replaying it endlessly in our minds, by building a case against the other person, by staying angry year after year, effectively prolonging our own suffering. The original hurt was undoubtedly real. Hiro had said harsh and hurtful things, fueled by stress and frustration. The argument was genuinely painful, a significant blow to their close relationship. But Kenji then took that single painful event and, through his conscious choice to hold on to resentment, turned it into years of ongoing suffering, a self-inflicted wound that never fully healed. Not because he had to, not because he was somehow forced into it, but because he didn't realize he had a choice, a way out of the cycle of anger. Notice that letting go of resentment wasn't about deciding that Hiro was somehow right or that the original argument didn't matter. It was about recognizing that the resentment itself was hurting Kenji far more than it was hurting anyone else, poisoning his own well-being. The monk's simple, direct question cut through Kenji's defenses and forced him to confront the truth. Is this making your life better, or is it making it worse? When Kenji looked honestly at that question without the distorting lens of anger, the answer was undeniably clear. The resentment was making him lonely, bitter, unable to sleep, and cut off from his community, effectively isolating him from the things that truly mattered. Hiro, meanwhile, was living his life normally, seemingly unaffected by Kenji's anger. The punishment wasn't landing where Kenji thought it was. This is what resentment invariably does. It boomerangs, harming the one who carries it far more than the intended target. It feels like we're holding the other person accountable, maintaining our dignity, and refusing to let them off the hook for their actions. But in reality, we're just carrying a heavy stone everywhere we go, a self-imposed burden that weighs us down, and the other person usually doesn't even notice or care. Sometimes the hurt goes far deeper than a simple argument between brothers. Sometimes the injury is profound, the betrayal devastating, the damage lasting and seemingly irreparable. But even in those most extreme circumstances, the fundamental question remains: who ultimately suffers from carrying this resentment? Who pays the highest price for clinging to the past? In a bustling town near the coast, there lived a respected merchant named Fumio, who owned and operated a small but thriving trading business. He had painstakingly built it up over many years, cultivating strong relationships with suppliers and customers alike, and earning a well-deserved reputation for fair dealing, honesty, and high-quality goods. Fumio had a trusted business partner, a man named Takeshi, who capably handled the accounting and logistical arrangements, allowing Fumio to focus on nurturing key relationships and traveling to secure new trade opportunities. They had worked together harmoniously for over a decade, and Fumio considered Takeshi not only a reliable partner, but also a close and trusted friend, someone he deeply valued. One season, Fumio embarked on a long and crucial trip to the northern provinces with the aim of establishing valuable new trade connections that would benefit the business for years to come. He was gone for several months, diligently working to forge new partnerships. When he finally returned, eager to share his successes and reconnect with his business, he made a devastating discovery. Takeshi had been systematically stealing from the business for a considerable amount of time. Not small, insignificant amounts, but substantial sums of money, carefully siphoned off over a long period, effectively eroding the company's profits. Takeshi had been meticulously keeping a separate set of books, showing Fumio false records that made it appear as though the business was barely profitable, while secretly pocketing a significant portion of the actual earnings for his own personal gain. When confronted with the evidence of his deceit, Takeshi showed no remorse, no hint of guilt or regret. He brazenly claimed that he deserved the extra money, arguing that he did far more work than Fumio realized, and that Fumio was away too often to truly understand the intricacies of the business anymore. He promptly dissolved the partnership, effectively abandoning Fumio and moved to another town, taking with him a large sum of money that legally belonged to both of them, a clear act of theft and betrayal. Fumio was completely devastated, emotionally and financially. He had trusted Takeshi implicitly, considering him a true friend. The betrayal felt deeply personal and profound, a stab in the back from someone he had held in high regard. And the financial loss was undeniably serious, posing a significant threat to the very survival of the business he had worked so tirelessly to build from the ground up. In the months that followed the betrayal, Fumio thought about Takeshi constantly, obsessively replaying the events in his mind. He would lie awake at night, his mind racing with imagined confrontations, fantasizing about elaborate schemes of revenge, and wishing for Takeshi to suffer as intensely as he was suffering. He told the story to anyone who would listen, meticulously describing Takeshi's betrayal in bitter, excruciating detail, seeking validation for his anger in a sympathetic ear. He even sent letters to merchants in the town where Takeshi had relocated, actively warning them about his former partner's dishonesty and questionable ethics, attempting to sabotage Takeshi's fresh start. The burning anger consumed him entirely, overshadowing everything else in his life. His business suffered significantly because he couldn't focus on it properly, his mind always preoccupied with thoughts of revenge. He became short-tempered with his loyal employees, unfairly lashing out at them. He grew suspicious of everyone around him, unable to trust anyone, fearing another betrayal. His physical health began to decline noticeably. He stopped eating well, neglecting his nutrition, and his sleep became erratic and disturbed. His wife watched with growing concern as he grew increasingly thinner, more haggard, and more consumed by his anger. One evening, an old and trusted friend came to visit, sensing Fumio's distress. They sat together in silence for a while, the weight of the situation heavy in the air. Finally, the friend spoke gently, his voice filled with compassion. Takeshi stole your money, Fumio. Are you going to allow him to steal your life as well? Fumio looked at him in surprise, taken aback by the unexpected question. What do you mean? He asked, genuinely puzzled. Just look at yourself, Fumio. Really look closely, his friend urged, his voice soft but firm. You're not eating, you're not sleeping, your business is failing because you can't focus your attention on it, and you've pushed away the people who care deeply about you. Takeshi took your money and left, disappearing from your life. But you're the one who's still here, still suffering, still letting him damage you, day after day. His betrayal continues to cast a long shadow, but you are the one who is allowing it to darken your world. But what he did was terrible, a complete violation of trust, Fumio protested, his voice rising with indignation. He deserves my anger. Surely I have a right to be angry, to feel this way. Maybe he does, his friend conceded thoughtfully. But does your anger actually hurt him? He's in another town, starting over, probably not even thinking about you at all. Meanwhile, you're here, destroying yourself over what he did, allowing his actions to define your life. Your anger is a weapon pointed inward, harming only yourself. So I should just forget about it? Pretend that it didn't happen? Fumio asked, his voice laced with disbelief. No, Fumio, remember it clearly, his friend advised. Learn from it. Take whatever practical steps you need to protect yourself, your future, and your business from similar situations. But stop drinking the poison of resentment. It's slowly killing you, not him. Fumio sat with these words for a long time, lost in deep thought. Part of him desperately wanted to reject the advice, to cling to his anger, to justify his pain. But another part of Fumio acknowledged the truth in his friend's words. He reflected on the state of his life since Takeshi's betrayal. He had been robbed once by Takeshi. That was true. However, he had been consistently robbing himself ever since, depriving himself of peace, health, and the ability to truly live. He thought about his business, a venture he had once loved with passion, now tainted by bitterness. He considered his wife, whom he had been so neglectful of lately, lost in his own resentment. He pondered the future he could create, if only he weren't consumed by constantly looking back at what he had lost. The decision to release his resentment wasn't a singular event, but a gradual process. Each time thoughts of Tishi surfaced, bringing the familiar wave of anger, Fumio would consciously acknowledge them and then make a different choice. He would refuse to fuel those thoughts with his attention. He wouldn't replay the story of the betrayal yet again in his mind. It was a challenge, no doubt. The habit of anger was deeply ingrained, and the hurt was undeniably real. But slowly, the resentment began to loosen its hold on him. Fumio realized he could go hours, then entire days, without thinking about Tishi at all. The anger still appeared from time to time, but it no longer consumed him as it once had. He began to rebuild his life. He restructured his business, putting in place new safeguards to prevent future incidents. He even hired a new partner, being far more cautious this time about who he trusted. He apologized to his wife for his emotional absence and began the journey of reconnecting with her. He started eating regular meals again, sleeping soundly through the night. His health began to improve significantly. A year after the betrayal, Fumio's business was thriving, performing better than it had in years. He had learned valuable lessons from the experience, gaining a newfound wisdom about trust and oversight, and implementing systems that provided better protection for his business. The loss, as painful as it was, had taught him valuable lessons that ultimately made him a better merchant. One day, he heard that Tishi's new ventures had failed, and that he was now facing financial difficulties. Fumio experienced a fleeting moment of satisfaction, but it quickly faded, leaving him feeling empty. He realized that he genuinely didn't care what happened to Tishi anymore. That chapter of his life was finally closed. When younger merchants sought his advice, he would occasionally recount the story of the betrayal and the lessons he had learned from it. But his focus was never on Tishi, or revenge, or the injustice of it all. Instead, he emphasized what he had discovered about the cost of resentment. Someone will wrong you in business, he would say. Um, that's almost inevitable. So the question is whether you will allow that wrong to continue to damage you long after the other person has moved on. He would explain that while the betrayal was Tishi's choice, the subsequent suffering he endured was his own. I could have chosen differently, he admitted. Fumio's hurt was undeniably deeper and more justified than Kenji's. Tishi's betrayal was a serious matter, and the damage it caused was real. No one would have blamed Fumio for being angry. The anger was a natural and understandable response. However, natural and understandable didn't necessarily equate to helpful. The anger wasn't bringing back Fumio's money. It wasn't punishing Tishi, and it certainly wasn't protecting Fumio from future betrayals. It was simply making Fumio's life smaller, darker, and more painful. His friend's pointed question struck at the core of the issue. Are you going to let him steal your life as well? Tishi had already taken money from Fumio. By clinging to resentment, Fumio was essentially allowing Tishi to continue taking from him his peace, his health, his relationships, and his ability to move forward. All of these precious things were being sacrificed to an anger that served absolutely no purpose. Letting go of the resentment wasn't about condoning the betrayal or pretending that Tishi was a good person. Fumio learned from what happened. He adjusted his business practices. He became wiser and more discerning, but he stopped carrying the emotional weight of the betrayal as a constant, debilitating burden. Both Kenji and Fumio ultimately discovered the same profound truth. Resentment is like a fire we hold in our own hands. We might think we're directing it at someone else, but in reality, we're the ones getting burned. The other person, whether they wronged us intentionally or unintentionally, whether the hurt was minor or significant, is usually off living their life. We're the ones who remain stuck, constantly replaying old injuries, unable to break free and move forward. The freedom that comes from releasing resentment isn't about the other person. It's not forgiveness in the sense of saying what they did was okay. It's far simpler and more self serving than that. It's recognizing that holding on to anger is ultimately hurting us and consciously choosing to put it down. This doesn't happen overnight. The habit of resentment is often deeply ingrained and well practiced. But each time we notice a resentful thought arising and choose not to indulge it, we loosen its grip a little bit more. Each time we redirect our attention from dwelling on old hurts to focusing on present possibilities, we reclaim a small piece of our life. The person who wronged us may never apologize, may never face consequences for their actions, and may never even realize the impact of what they did. That's simply not within our control. But whether we continue to suffer over their actions, that is entirely up to us. As you rest tonight, take a moment to notice if you're carrying resentment toward anyone, not to judge yourself for it, but simply to acknowledge its presence. And then ask yourself honestly, is carrying this resentment making my life better? Is this weight truly worth bearing? Don't consider what the other person deserves, but rather what you deserve. Do you deserve peace, or do you deserve to keep suffering over something that's already done? The answer, when we examine it with clarity, is almost always obvious. And sometimes that very clarity is the crucial first step toward finally laying down a burden that we never needed to carry in the first place. Most of us spend very little time truly present in the moment. We're physically present, but our attention is constantly elsewhere. We're replaying yesterday's conversations, planning tomorrow's tasks, worrying about next week's challenges, and regretting last year's mistakes. We're anywhere but here, anytime but now. This constant mental wandering wouldn't be so problematic if the past and future were actual places we could inhabit, but they're not. The past is gone, existing only as memories and thoughts. The future hasn't arrived yet and exists solely as imagination and projection. The present moment, right now, is the only place where we truly exist. And yet, ironically, it's the place we visit least often. Zen Buddhism highlights a simple yet profound observation. All our worry stems from thoughts about the future, and all our regret arises from thoughts about the past. But the present moment, the actual here and now, is almost always workable. Right now, in this moment, without adding thoughts about what was or what will be, things are usually okay. This isn't to say that the present moment is always pleasant. Sometimes it contains difficulty, discomfort, and challenges. But even challenging present moments are fundamentally different from the suffering we create by abandoning the present to dwell on past regrets or future anxieties. The present moment possesses a quality of inherent simplicity. It's just what it is, without the layers of story and interpretation that we often add. When we're truly present, the mind becomes quieter. Not because we're actively trying to silence it, but because thinking primarily involves the past and the future. When our attention is fully present, fully here and now, there's simply less for the mind to do. We can then simply experience what's actually happening, rather than constantly thinking about it, judging it, or comparing it to other moments. This presence isn't complicated. It's not some special state that requires years of dedicated training. It's available to us right now, at this very moment. It's the natural result of bringing our attention to what is actually here, rather than to our thoughts about what was or what will be. In a village nestled amidst sprawling rice fields lived a farmer named Jiro who had cultivated the same land for the majority of his life. He possessed an intimate knowledge of every inch of his fields, every subtle variation in the soil, and every spot where water tended to accumulate after a rain. His father and grandfather had worked this land before him, and he fully expected that his son would carry on the tradition after he was gone. Jiro was exceptionally skilled at his work. He understood the natural rhythms of planting and harvesting, and he knew precisely when to irrigate and when to allow the fields to rest. His yields were consistently reliable, and his rice was of exceptional quality. However, despite his remarkable skill and undeniable success, Jiro rarely experienced a sense of inner peace. During planting season, he would constantly worry about the upcoming harvest. Would there be sufficient rainfall? Would there be too much? Would the autumn storms arrive prematurely? He would plant the young rice seedlings while simultaneously thinking months ahead to the harvest, meticulously calculating potential yields and devising contingency plans in case the weather didn't cooperate. During the growing season, his mind was preoccupied with concerns about pests, diseases, and the overall health of the plants. He would walk through his fields, ostensibly examining the rice, but he wasn't truly seeing what was in front of him. He was constantly imagining worst-case scenarios, crafting elaborate contingency plans, and projecting himself into a future that hadn't yet come to pass. When the harvest season finally arrived, he barely even noticed it. He was already mentally consumed with planning for the next year's planting, addressing the necessary repairs to the storage building, and replacing tools that were beginning to show signs of wear. The very harvest that he had spent months worrying about would come and go while his mind was preoccupied elsewhere. One year, an elderly monk named Soen arrived to stay at a small temple located near Jiro's village. The monk was traveling slowly through the region, often stopping to rest for weeks at a time. He frequently strolled through the countryside, and his path occasionally led him past Jiro's fields. One spring morning, Soen paused at the edge of a field where Jiro was diligently planting. The farmer was bent over, carefully placing the seedlings in neat, orderly rows, but his face was etched with tension. He worked quickly and mechanically, his mind clearly occupied with something other than the task at hand. "Beautiful morning," Soen remarked. Jiro looked up, startled. "Yes, I suppose so." "You suppose so? You're not certain?" Soen asked gently. Jiro straightened up, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "I don't have time to notice the morning. I have to finish planting this section before the weather changes." "I see," Soen responded. "And when you finish planting, what then?" "Then I have to repair the irrigation channels before the water comes. And after that, I have to monitor the fields for pests, maintain the terraces, and prepare for the harvest." "And after the harvest, you'll prepare for next year's planting?" Soen inquired, nodding slowly. "So you're always preparing for the next thing, constantly thinking ahead to what needs to be done. When do you actually do what you're doing?" Jiro didn't quite understand the question. "I am doing it. I'm planting right now." "Are you really? Your hands are planting, that's true. But where is your mind?" Jiro realized with a growing sense of discomfort that while his hands had been diligently placing seedlings, his mind had been preoccupied with calculating whether he would have enough rice seed to cover the entire field, worrying about a particular section where water tended to pool, and planning the work for the following day. He hadn't actually been present to the act of planting at all. "I have a lot to think about," he said defensively. "Farming isn't simple." "No, it isn't," Soen agreed. "But tell me, does thinking about the harvest while you plant actually make the planting go any better?" "I suppose not," Jiro conceded. "But I need to plan ahead." There's a difference between planning and worry, between intelligent preparation and the constant mental rehearsal of things that haven't even happened yet, Soen explained gently. Over the next few weeks, Soen would occasionally appear at the edge of Jiro's fields. He never stayed for long or said very much, but his mere presence seemed to remind Jiro to be mindful of where his mind was wandering. And whenever Jiro took a moment to notice, he invariably discovered that his thoughts were focused on somewhere other than the present moment. One afternoon, while Jiro was checking the water levels in his fields, Soen asked him, "What are you doing right now?" "Checking the water," Jiro replied. "And how does the water look?" Soen inquired. Jiro realized with a start that he didn't actually know. He had been walking along the irrigation channels, but he hadn't truly been looking at the water. He had been preoccupied with thinking about whether it would rain later in the week, calculating how many days until he would need to irrigate again, and worrying about a section of the channel that needed repair. "I don't know," he admitted sheepishly. "I wasn't really looking." "Perhaps look now," Soen suggested. Jiro stopped and genuinely looked at the water flowing through the channel. He noticed how it caught the light of the afternoon sun, how it created a gentle, soothing sound as it flowed, and how small plants thrived along its edges. These were all things he passed by every day, but had never truly seen. "When you're checking the water but thinking about next week's rain," Soen observed, "you're missing both. You're not really checking the water, and you can't actually know about next week's rain. You're simply creating anxiety." This conversation stayed with Jiro long after Soen had departed. He began to notice how rarely he was truly present to whatever he was doing. While working, his mind was busy planning. While eating, his mind was replaying the day's events. And while attempting to fall asleep, his mind was creating a list of tasks for the following day. He was never fully where he was. He started practicing something simple. Whenever he noticed that his mind had wandered off to the past or the future, he would gently bring his attention back to what he was actually doing, not as a rigid exercise, but rather as a gentle reminder to himself of where he was. When planting, just plant. When walking, just walk. When eating, just eat. It was far more challenging than he had initially anticipated. His mind was so accustomed to constantly projecting ahead, planning, and worrying. Bringing it back to the present felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable. The present moment seemed too simple, too quiet. But over time, something shifted within him. He began to notice things he had been missing for years. The way the morning light illuminated his fields, the sensation of the soil in his hands, the deep satisfaction of completing a row of planting. These simple yet profound experiences had been happening all along, but he had been too preoccupied with his thoughts to notice them. His work began to feel different. Not easier in terms of physical effort, but somehow lighter. When he was planting, he was simply planting without carrying the weight of 1,000 future concerns. When a problem arose, he addressed it directly, without adding layers of anxiety about all the other potential problems that might arise later. One summer evening, Soen came to sit with Jiro at the edge of the fields. The rice was tall and green, swaying gently in the breeze. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light gradually change as the sun began to set. "I've been farming these fields my whole life," Jiro said quietly, "but I don't think I truly saw them until recently. I was always somewhere else in my mind, always focused on what was coming next. And now I'm here more often. Not always, but more. And I've realized that most of what I was worrying about never actually happened. I spent years feeling anxious about possible disasters that never came to pass. And even the real problems that did arise, I handled them when they came. The worry beforehand didn't help at all. The future will come in its own time," Soen said gently. "The past is already gone, but this moment right now, this is real. The wind on your face is real. The sight of your fields is real. This is where your life is actually happening." Jiro continued to farm for many more years. He still planned appropriately, and he still prepared for the seasons ahead. But he stopped living in a constant state of projection and anxiety. When he planted, he was present to the act of planting. When he harvested, he was present to the harvest. And in that presence, he discovered a sense of peace that all of his planning and worrying had never been able to provide. When younger farmers sought his advice, he would tell them about the years he had spent missing his own life while worrying about the future. "Learn to be where you are," he would say. "The work doesn't necessarily get easier, but you'll actually be present for your life, instead of always thinking about what comes next." Jiro's experience illustrates a common tendency that many of us engage in without realizing it. We're physically present, but mentally absent. Our attention is scattered across time, replaying the past or rehearsing the future. We miss the rich texture of our lives because we're too busy thinking about life rather than actually experiencing it. Notice that when someone asked him what he was doing, Jiro could readily name the activity, but he wasn't actually experiencing it. His hands were planting, while his mind was months ahead at the harvest. His body was checking the water, while his mind was days ahead, worrying about rain. He was like a person watching a movie while simultaneously thinking about an entirely different movie. The shift for Jiro wasn't about ceasing all planning or preparation. He still needed to think ahead appropriately. But he discovered the crucial distinction between useful planning and constant anxious projection. One helps us to work skillfully, while the other simply creates unnecessary suffering without providing any benefit. When Jiro learned to be more present, he didn't become any less competent as a farmer. If anything, he became more attentive and skilled because he was actually seeing what was in front of him, rather than being lost in his thoughts. The present moment provided him with far better information than his anxious projections ever had. What he found in the present wasn't always pleasant. Some days the work was tiring. Some seasons brought genuine challenges. But even difficult present moments possessed a simplicity that the constant worry lacked. A tired body is just a tired body. A pest problem is just a pest problem. These things are workable. It's the layers of anxious thinking that we add that make them feel so overwhelming. The past creates its own distinct kind of absence. We can be physically here, but mentally living in what was, replaying old scenes, wishing things had turned out differently, and carrying what's already gone as if it's still happening in the present. In a town renowned for its schools and scholars, there lived a teacher named Ayako who had dedicated her life to the pursuit of education. She had taught for 20 years, first in a small village school and then at a respected academy in the larger town. She deeply loved teaching, loved seeing her students discover new ideas, and cherished the feeling of helping young people find their way in the world. Then something happened that irrevocably changed everything. The academy where she taught hired a new director, a man with very different ideas about education. He sought to modernize the curriculum and bring in younger teachers who utilized new teaching methods. After a difficult year characterized by increasing tension, Ayako was informed that her position was being eliminated. The dismissal was presented as a budgetary issue, but Ayako knew the real reason. The new director simply preferred different approaches than hers. She felt pushed out, undervalued, and dismissed after years of dedicated service. At the age of 50, she found herself without a clear path forward. She managed to secure a position at a smaller school, one that paid less and had significantly fewer resources. The work was adequate, but it lacked the fulfillment that her previous position had provided, and she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Every day, she would replay scenes from her last year at the academy, the meeting where the director had criticized her teaching methods, the moment she was informed that her position was ending, and the awkward farewell gathering where she had desperately tried to maintain her dignity while feeling utterly humiliated. These scenes played out in her mind like a performance she couldn't stop watching. She would imagine different responses she could have made, more forceful defenses, ways she could have fought harder, or alternative ways she could have handled things. In her mind, she was constantly revising history, creating different versions where things had gone differently, where she was vindicated, and where the director realized his mistake. Her thoughts about the past completely consumed her. While teaching her current students, she would often find herself thinking about her old academy. While preparing her lessons, she would unfavorably compare this small school to her previous workplace. And while trying to fall asleep at night, she would replay old conversations, old conflicts, and old disappointments. She grew increasingly bitter. Her teaching began to suffer because she simply wasn't fully present. Her students noticed that she seemed distracted and that her attention was often elsewhere. The joy that she had once derived from her work was gone, replaced by a heavy cloud of negativity that seemed to color everything. One afternoon, a student stayed behind after class. She was a quiet girl who rarely spoke up, but she had been watching Ayako with growing concern. "Teacher," the girl said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," Ayako replied. "You seem sad, like you don't want to be here. Do you not like teaching anymore?" The question struck Ayako deeply. She had been so lost in her thoughts about her old academy that she hadn't even realized how her students were perceiving her. This girl, this real student who was standing right in front of her, was being taught by someone whose heart was somewhere else entirely. "I'm sorry," Ayako said, her voice filled with regret. "You're right. I've been distracted, but not because of you or this school, but because of something that happened before." "Can you fix it?" the girl asked. "No, it's already done. It's in the past," Ayako replied. The girl looked confused. "Then why do you keep thinking about it?" It was such a simple question, asked with such genuine curiosity, that Ayako had no ready answer. Why was she constantly thinking about something that was over, done, and unchangeable? What was she gaining from these endless mental replays? That evening, Ayako sat in her small apartment and tried to assess her situation with clarity. She had been wronged, there was no doubt about that. The dismissal had been unfair, but it had happened a year ago. The director was still at the academy, likely not even thinking about her at all. The job was gone, and none of her mental replays would change that reality. Meanwhile, she had students here now who deserved a teacher who was fully present and engaged. She had work in front of her that could be meaningful if she allowed it to be. She had a life happening right now that she was missing because she was choosing to live in the past. She thought about the student's question, can you fix it? The answer was a resounding no. The past was unchangeable. No amount of mental revision would ever alter what had happened. She was currently expending her present energy trying to change something that no longer existed. Over the following weeks, Ayako made a conscious effort to notice whenever her mind wandered off to the past. It happened frequently, sometimes dozens of times in a single day. Each time, she would acknowledge the thought and gently redirect her attention back to the present, back to the student in front of her, back to the lesson she was teaching, and back to the moment she was actually in. It was surprisingly difficult. The past felt important somehow. As if she were to stop replaying it, she would be letting the director off the hook or betraying herself. But gradually, she realized that the only person these thoughts were hurting was herself. The director wasn't affected by her mental replays. The academy was continuing on without her. She was the only one suffering from this constant backward looking. As she began to release her grip on the past, something unexpected happened. She began to view her current school in a different light. It was smaller, yes, with fewer resources, but the students were genuine and eager to learn. She had more freedom to teach as she pleased. And the smaller classes allowed for more personal connection. Her teaching came alive again. Her students noticed the change. She was truly present with them, actually listening and genuinely seeing them. The joy that had been absent from her work began to return, not because her circumstances had changed, but because she had stopped trying to live in the past. Years later, Ayako would look back on her dismissal from the academy as a difficult, but ultimately liberating experience. It had forced her into a change that she wouldn't have chosen on her own, but that change had brought unexpected gifts, including a deeper appreciation for her students and her craft. But more importantly, it had taught her something profound about how she related to her own past. When younger teachers came to her with their own disappointments and setbacks, she would listen with understanding and empathy. And she would sometimes tell them about the year she had spent mentally living in the past while her present life happened without her. The past is a place you can visit in memory, she would say, but you cannot live there. Every moment you spend trying to live in what was, you are missing what is. And what is the only place where your life is actually happening. Ayako's dwelling in the past is yet another demonstration of how leaving the present moment is a common trap. Just as Jiro was lost in his future aspirations, Ayako was stuck in her past experiences. Neither of them were truly engaged in their current lives, their minds preoccupied elsewhere. Ayako's constant revisiting of the past wasn't helping her heal or change what had happened. Instead, it kept her confined within a painful narrative, hindering her ability to move forward. She mistakenly believed that this repetitive mental replay was a form of crucial processing, but it was simply perpetuating her suffering. The student's straightforward question cut through Ayako's complex thoughts. Can you fix it? The answer was no. Then why dwell on it? There was no rational answer, except that it had become an ingrained habit, a default mental pathway. When Ayako began redirecting her attention to the present, she didn't deny the reality of the past events. The dismissal and the hurt were real. However, she ceased trying to live in a time that no longer existed and stopped allowing past events to negatively impact her present life. What she discovered in the present wasn't perfect. Her new job offered less prestige, lower pay, and fewer opportunities, but it was tangible. It was happening now. By fully embracing it, she found its inherent value. The students in front of her were real individuals who deserved a teacher who was fully present, not someone whose thoughts were constantly elsewhere. Both Jiro and Ayako arrived at the same realization, albeit from different paths. Life unfolds in the present moment. The past is a memory. The future is an imagined possibility, but only the present is real. When we are fully present and engaged with what is, we often discover that the current moment, exactly as it is manageable. It might not always be enjoyable or easy, but it's workable. And it's undoubtedly better than the suffering we inflict upon ourselves by constantly escaping into times that don't exist. There is a simplicity to the present moment that the past and future lack. The present simply is what it is: a tired body, an unfinished task, a conversation unfolding, a meal being enjoyed, a breath being taken. Simple, direct, and immediate. No elaborate narratives or complex thinking are required. When we are truly present, our minds naturally quiet down. This isn't because we are suppressing thoughts, but because much of our thinking revolves around the past and future. When our attention is focused on the present, the mind has less to do. We can simply experience what's happening without excessive analysis. This doesn't mean we should never remember the past or plan for the future. We do so when it's beneficial, but we do it from a foundation of presence rather than losing ourselves in those times. We recall something when it's relevant, plan something when it's necessary, and then return to the present. The present moment becomes our home, while the past and future become places we visit briefly rather than where we reside. As you settle down to rest tonight, pay attention to where your mind wanders. Does it drift to tomorrow's worries? Does it replay today's events? Does it stray to old memories or future anxieties? Each time you notice your attention has wandered from the present, gently guide it back. Focus on this moment, this breath, the simple reality of being here now exactly as you are. The peace available in the present isn't something you need to create or achieve. It's what emerges when you stop leaving. When your mind isn't projecting into imagined futures or replaying unchangeable pasts, there's a natural settling, a simple presence, not blank emptiness. Just this, just now, just here. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that arises not from hard work, but from constantly striving to become someone other than who we are. We aspire to be better, more accomplished, more peaceful, more enlightened. We're always reaching for the next level, the next achievement, the next version of ourselves that will finally be enough. Um, this striving often feels virtuous. We label it self-improvement, growth, or development. We convince ourselves that if we work hard enough and push ourselves far enough, we'll eventually reach a state where we can finally rest, where we'll feel complete and acceptable. However, Zen Buddhism observes a key point about this perpetual striving. It never truly leads to rest. Each achieved goal simply reveals another goal beyond it. Each level attained reveals a higher level to reach. The finish line keeps moving because we keep moving it. We've created a race without an end, and we're exhausting ourselves by running it. There's an alternative approach, though it may seem counterintuitive to those accustomed to constant effort. What if you are already complete? Not perfect, not finished developing, but fundamentally whole right now. What if peace isn't something you attain through striving, but something you discover when the striving ceases? This doesn't imply becoming passive or halting natural growth. It means stopping the draining effort of constantly trying to be different from who we are. We can act, learn, and develop, but from a foundation of already being enough rather than from a desperate sense of inadequacy. The individuals in tonight's stories all realized that what they were seeking was closer than they imagined. It wasn't far off at the end of some arduous path, but right here, present in the moment, available when they stopped running away from it. In a secluded mountain monastery, there lived a monk named Tuan who had dedicated 12 years to meditation. He was renowned among the other monks for his unwavering commitment. He would meditate longer than anyone else, often extending his sessions by hours beyond the scheduled times. He adhered to every rule meticulously and studied the teachings diligently. He was determined to attain enlightenment. Every morning, Tuan would rise before the other monks and meditate, striving to quiet his mind and achieve a state of perfect clarity. Each evening, he would sit long after the others had retired to sleep, continuing his practice. During work periods, he would silently recite sutras to himself. During meals, he would eat mindfully, carefully attending to each bite. From an external perspective, Tuan seemed like the ideal practitioner. However, internally he was depleted. The constant effort to be mindful, present, and enlightened was wearing him down. Despite his dedication, he felt he was making no progress. His mind was no quieter than when he had started, his clarity no greater. He still experienced frustration, distractions, and the ordinary human reactions he was trying to overcome. The abbot of the monastery, an elderly monk named Hakuan, observed Tuan's intense practice with concern. One day he summoned Tuan to his room. "Tell me," Hakuan began, "what are you seeking?" "Enlightenment, master. I am trying to awaken. to see clearly, to be free from suffering. And how is that progressing? Tuan felt the burden of his 12 years of unwavering effort. I don't know. I practice constantly, but I feel no closer than when I began. Perhaps I'm not trying hard enough. Maybe I need to sit longer, practice more intensely. Hakuan paused for a moment before responding. Let me share a story with you. There once was a man who longed to witness the sunset. He had heard it was beautiful beyond words, that experiencing it would transform his life. So he began traveling westward, walking towards the sun's descent. He walked for days, weeks, and months, always moving west, constantly seeking the sunset. But no matter how far he traveled, the sunset remained elusive, always on the horizon, never within his grasp. What became of him? Tuan inquired. He died exhausted, still walking west, never understanding that the sunset comes to you. You don't go to it. You simply stop and watch it arrive. Tuan absorbed the story, feeling a sense of unease stirring within him. Are you suggesting I should cease practicing? I am suggesting that enlightenment is not a destination you reach through strenuous effort. It's not far away, waiting for you to finally become worthy of it. What you seek is already present here and now. However, you are too preoccupied with seeking to notice it. But if I don't strive, how will I improve? How will I overcome my obstacles? Your striving has become your primary obstacle. You are so busy trying to be peaceful that you cannot experience peace. You are so busy trying to be present that you miss the present moment. You are so busy trying to achieve enlightenment that you overlook the awareness that is already here. Hakuan requested Tuan to try something different for the following month. Instead of his intense practice regimen, he should reduce his practice. He should sit for the scheduled periods with the other monks, but not for the extra hours. He should work during work time without reciting sutras. He should eat his meals without turning them into a meditation exercise. He should simply be ordinary. This instruction caused Tuan anxiety. If he stopped his intense practice, wouldn't he fall behind? Wouldn't all his years of effort be wasted? However, he trusted his teacher, so he agreed to try. The first few days felt unsettling. During the times he usually spent in extra meditation, he found himself restless, unsure of what to do. He felt guilty for not striving, as if he were betraying his commitment. But Hakuan had been clear, just be ordinary for a month. After about a week, a shift began to occur. The constant tension that had been driving him began to dissipate. He noticed he was sleeping better. During scheduled meditation, he found his mind settling more easily than when he had been forcing it for hours. One afternoon, Tuan was sweeping the courtyard, just sweeping, without trying to turn it into spiritual practice or use it as an opportunity for mindfulness training. The broom moved across the stones, the sound of the bristles on the rock, the autumn leaves gathering in small piles, sunlight streaming through the trees. In that simple moment, something became clear. The awareness that was noticing the sweeping, the sounds, the light. This awareness was already peaceful. It wasn't something he needed to achieve. It was already here, already clear, already free. He had been striving so hard to attain something he already possessed. He stopped sweeping and stood still, the broom in his hands. The noticing continued, breath moving, sounds present, the simple fact of being aware. This had been here all along, through all his years of intense practice. He just hadn't been able to see it because he was too busy trying to get somewhere else. That evening, Tuan went to see Hakuan. I think I understand, he said quietly. I've been like that man walking west, trying to reach something that can only come when I stop walking. Yes. And the awareness I was seeking, it's already here. It's what's noticing my thoughts, my striving, my exhaustion. It was never absent. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy looking for it. Hakuan smiled. You've been carrying a heavy load for 12 years. How does it feel to put it down? Light, and somehow sad too. All that effort, all that struggle. And what I needed was to stop struggling. Not wasted, Hakuan said gently. The struggling brought you to the point where you could finally stop. Sometimes we need to try very hard before we can understand that trying isn't the answer. Tuan continued to practice, but differently. He sat in meditation, but without the grim determination to achieve something. He worked, but without constantly monitoring whether he was being mindful enough. He lived more simply, more ordinarily, and in that ordinariness, he found the peace he had been seeking through extraordinary effort. Years later, when students would come to him pushing themselves too hard, Exhausting themselves with intense practice, he would tell them about his 12 years of striving. I don't regret those years, he would say. But I learned that peace isn't achieved through effort. It's what remains when unnecessary effort stops. You can't force yourself into freedom. You can only stop forcing and discover the freedom that's already here. Tuan's story illustrates how striving can become its own obstacle. His dedication wasn't inherently wrong, but he had transformed practice into a project, enlightenment into a goal that always remained just out of reach. The harder he tried to be peaceful, the more tension he created. The more intensely he sought clarity, the more clouded his vision became. The shift occurred when he stopped trying so hard and simply allowed himself to be ordinary, not giving up, but releasing the desperate, grasping quality that had infected his practice. In that release, he could finally see what had been present all along. This highlights something paradoxical about striving. Often we can't find what we're seeking because the seeking itself obscures it. We're looking so hard, trying so intensely, that we miss the simple reality right in front of us. We're like someone frantically searching for their glasses while wearing them. The awareness Tuan discovered wasn't something he created through his practice. It was already here, noticing everything, including his striving and frustration. His practice didn't produce this awareness. It only helped him recognize what was already present. Sometimes this striving manifests not in spiritual practice, but in ordinary life, in the constant drive to improve ourselves to become better versions of who we are. In a coastal town renowned for its pottery, there lived a woman named Ume, who crafted simple tea bowls and cups. She had learned the craft from her mother and had been working with clay for 20 years. Her pieces were functional and honest, appreciated by local people who used them daily. However, Ume wasn't satisfied. She would visit other potters whose work was more refined, more artistic. She would admire their elegant forms and sophisticated glazes and feel inadequate. She began taking every available class, learning new techniques, and studying different traditions. She would work late into the night, striving to improve her skills. She began criticizing her own work harshly. Each piece she created was compared to an ideal in her mind, an ideal that kept changing, always remaining just beyond her reach. Nothing she created seemed good enough. She would finish a bowl and immediately notice its flaws, its lack of sophistication, all the ways it fell short. Her students noticed the change in her. She had always been encouraging, patient with their learning process. Now she was critical, pointing out flaws, pushing them to be better. The joy that had characterized her teaching was replaced with a driven intensity. One of her oldest students, a man named Saburo, who made pottery as a hobby, stopped attending classes. Ume was surprised and disappointed. Saburo had been with her for years and was a dedicated student. She went to visit him to understand why he had stopped. She found Saburo at his home, working in a small studio he had set up in his garden. He was making a simple cup, working slowly with obvious pleasure in the process. When he saw Ume, he smiled warmly. "Teacher, thank you for coming. Please sit. I wanted to ask why you've stopped attending classes." Saburo set down his tools and poured tea for both of them, using cups he had made himself. They were simple, slightly uneven, glazed in a plain gray. "I stopped because I remembered why I started," he said. "I began pottery because I loved working with clay, the feeling of it in my hands, the pleasure of making something useful. But your classes recently, they became about achieving, about becoming better, about reaching some standard. The joy was gone." Ume felt defensive. "But isn't improvement important? Shouldn't we strive to develop our skills?" "Perhaps. But I'm a rice merchant, not a master potter. I make pottery because it brings me peace. When it becomes another area of life where I'm not good enough, where I'm constantly striving to be better, it stops being peaceful. It becomes just more work." He picked up one of his simple gray cups. "I know this isn't sophisticated. I know it's not as refined as what you make or what other potters create, but I made it with my own hands and it holds tea perfectly. For me, that's enough." Ume looked at the cup. It was plain, yes, but there was something honest about it, something peaceful. She thought about her own work, about the sophisticated pieces she'd been trying to create. They were technically better than what Saburo made, but had any of them been made with the simple contentment she saw in this humble cup? She realized something uncomfortable. She had been making pottery to prove something, to achieve something, to become someone more skilled. Saburo was making pottery because he enjoyed making pottery. She was striving, he was simply doing. When did I lose that? She asked quietly. When did I stop enjoying the clay and start using it to chase some idea of who I should be? Saburo poured more tea. I think it happened gradually. You're very skilled, much more than me. But maybe that skill became a burden. Maybe you started thinking you should always be more skilled, always improving, always reaching higher. After that conversation, Ume began to examine her relationship with her craft. She saw how she had transformed it into a constant evaluation, a never-ending project of self-improvement. She never just made pottery anymore. She was always trying to make better pottery, trying to achieve something, trying to prove something. She thought about when she had started 20 years ago. Back then, she had been content to make simple things. The pleasure had been in the making itself, in the feel of clay responding to her hands, in the satisfaction of creating something useful. When had that simple pleasure been replaced by this driven striving? She decided to try something different. For 1 month, she would make only the simplest pieces, basic bowls and cups, nothing sophisticated or showy. And she would try to do it the way Saburo did, for the simple pleasure of working with clay rather than to achieve any particular result. The first week was difficult. Her mind constantly criticized the simple pieces. They were boring, basic, nothing special. She should be challenging herself, trying new things, developing her skills. But she stayed with the practice. By the second week, something began to soften. She noticed she was enjoying the work again. The feel of the clay centering on the wheel, the way water helped her hands shape the form, the smell of earth. These simple pleasures had been there all along, but she had been too focused on achieving to notice them. She made dozens of simple bowls. Some came out well, some didn't, but she found she didn't care as much about the results. The pleasure was in the making. And interestingly, without trying so hard, her work began to possess a quality it had lacked during her period of intense striving, a kind of ease, a simplicity that came from not forcing. Saburo came back to her classes. He noticed the change immediately. You seem different, he said, more like when I first started studying with you. I am different. Or maybe I'm the same as I was before I started trying so hard to be different, she laughed at the confusion of the sentence. I've been exhausting myself trying to become a better potter. I forgot that I was already a potter. That was enough. Years passed. Ume continued to develop her skills, continued to learn and grow, but the desperate quality was gone. She wasn't running towards some imagined version of herself that would finally be acceptable. She was simply working with clay day by day, finding satisfaction in the work itself, rather than in some future achievement. When students would push themselves too hard, criticizing their work harshly, she would tell them about her conversation with Saburo, about the month she spent making simple bowls, about discovering that striving can become a way of never being satisfied with where you are. Skill develops naturally when you practice, she would say. But if you're always focused on becoming more skilled, you miss the pleasure of the skill you already have. You miss the simple satisfaction of making something with your own hands. The striving keeps you always somewhere else, always in the future, never here where the clay actually is. Ume's experience highlights another aspect of striving. She was good at pottery, but being good wasn't enough. She needed to be better, then better still. The goal kept receding because she kept moving it. Each level of skill achieved simply revealed another level to strive for. What she found in that month of simple work wasn't that skill doesn't matter. It's that the constant striving to be more skilled had separated her from the direct experience of making pottery. She was so focused on becoming that she couldn't simply be. Saburo's contentment stemmed from a different place. He wasn't trying to be a master potter. He was enjoying being someone who makes pottery. The difference between those two orientations is vast. One involves constant dissatisfaction and striving. The other allows for present enjoyment. Notice that when Ume released the driven quality, her work actually improved, not because she was trying harder, but because she was trying less hard. The striving had been creating tension that showed in her work. When she relaxed into simple making, something more genuine could emerge. Both Tuan and Ume discovered that what they were seeking wasn't far away, requiring years more effort to reach. It was here in the present moment, available when the seeking stopped. Tuan found the awareness he was pursuing in intense meditation when he allowed himself to just sweep the courtyard. Ume found the satisfaction she was chasing through technical mastery when she returned to making simple bowls with presence. This is what Zen Buddhism points to again and again. The constant striving to be somewhere other than where we are creates the very dissatisfaction it's trying to solve. We think we'll finally be at peace when we achieve the next goal, reach the next level, become the next version of ourselves. But that peace is always postponed, always just ahead. What if you're already enough? Not perfect, not finished developing, but fundamentally complete right now. What if peace isn't at the end of some long journey of self-improvement, but here, available the moment you stop running? This doesn't mean you stop learning or growing. Both Tuan and Ume continued to develop after their realizations, but they were no longer driven by a sense of inadequacy. They could learn and grow from a foundation of already being whole rather than from a desperate attempt to become whole. The exhaustion many of us feel isn't from working hard. It's from constantly trying to be different than we are, constantly striving towards some imagined better version of ourselves. That exhaustion lifts not when we finally achieve enough, but when we recognize we already are enough. As you rest tonight, you might notice if you've been carrying this burden, the endless project of self-improvement, the constant evaluation of whether you're good enough yet, the striving towards some version of yourself that will finally be acceptable. What would it be like to put that down, even just for tonight? To be exactly as you are without needing to be different, better, or more. To rest in the simple fact of being here, complete in this moment. Nothing missing, nothing to achieve. We live with a persistent feeling that something is missing. Not enough time, not enough money, not enough success, not enough comfort. This sense of lack follows us through our days, creating a constant low-level anxiety. If only we had a bit more, we tell ourselves, then we could finally relax. So we work to acquire more possessions, more achievements, more experiences, more security. That's the promise we often chase. We tell ourselves we're working toward that magical point where we finally have enough and can relax, but that point seems to perpetually elude us. Each milestone reached only reveals a new desire, a new perceived lack. The finish line of enough keeps receding as we get closer. Zen Buddhism offers a different perspective, a profound shift in thinking. What if enough isn't a destination to reach, but a lens through which to see the world? What if the sensation of having enough springs not from accumulating more possessions, but from truly recognizing and appreciating what we already possess? It's not about striving for what we lack, but about clearly seeing the abundance that surrounds us. This isn't about settling for less or abandoning the pursuit of self-improvement. It's about understanding that lasting contentment doesn't stem from material accumulation. A person with very little can feel incredibly rich, while someone with immense wealth can still feel desperately impoverished. The key difference lies not in their possessions, but in their attitude toward what they have. There's a deep sense of peace that arises from recognizing enough. It's not the fleeting peace of finally acquiring everything we desire, because desires are endless, but the enduring peace of realizing we already possess everything we truly need. This very moment, as it is, holds a fullness that constant acquisition can never provide. But we often miss it, too preoccupied with focusing on what's missing. The individuals in tonight's stories each experienced this transformative shift from relentlessly seeking more to deeply appreciating what was already present in their lives, not through losing what they had, but through a newfound clarity of vision. In a prosperous town, there lived a silk merchant named Hideyaki, who had painstakingly built a thriving business over many years. He owned a spacious house, adorned himself in fine clothing, enjoyed lavish meals, and employed servants to manage his household. By all objective measures, he was a man of wealth and comfort. Yet Hideaki was plagued by a persistent sense of dissatisfaction. When he looked at his house, he saw only the areas that needed renovation, comparing it unfavorably to the grander houses he had visited. When he considered his business, his mind raced with ideas for increasing profits and expanding into new markets. At social gatherings, he couldn't help but notice those with finer attire, more influential connections, and greater success. He tirelessly devoted himself to expanding his wealth, constantly devising plans for expansion, acquiring more property, and elevating his social standing. In his mind, there was always another level to attain, another acquisition that would finally bring him the elusive feelings of security and contentment. One summer, Hideaki embarked on a journey to a remote mountain village to explore the possibility of establishing a new trade route. The journey proved longer than anticipated, and as evening approached, he found himself still far from his destination, with no place to spend the night. He stumbled upon a humble dwelling at the edge of a forest, where an elderly farmer sat outside, watching the sun descend behind the majestic mountains. Hideaki approached the farmer and requested shelter for the night. "Of course," the farmer replied warmly. "Please come in. My wife will prepare some food for us." The house was incredibly small, consisting of only 2 rooms. The floor was made of packed earth covered with simple, worn mats. The walls were constructed of rough wood, with noticeable gaps where the boards didn't quite align. The furnishings were sparse: a low table, a few cushions, and some cooking pots near the fire. The farmer's wife served them a simple meal of rice, pickled vegetables, and miso soup. They ate by the soft glow of a single oil lamp. After the meal, Hideaki felt obligated to make conversation, although he found the evident poverty of the place unsettling. "Have you lived here long?" he asked. "My whole life," the farmer replied. "My father built this house, and my son will inherit it when I'm gone." "It must be difficult living so simply," Hideaki remarked. "Do you not wish for more?" The farmer seemed genuinely perplexed by the question. "More what? More comfort? A larger house? Better furnishings? Security?" "Ah, well, the house keeps the rain off our heads," the farmer responded. "We have a small plot of land that provides us with rice and vegetables. There's a spring nearby with clean water, and we have each other's company. What more would we need?" Hideaki almost laughed at the farmer's seemingly naive simplicity. "But don't you want to improve your situation? To have an easier life?" The farmer considered this for a moment. "I suppose the house could be larger, but then we'd have more rooms to heat in the winter, more space to clean. My life is already easy enough. I work in the morning, rest in the afternoon, and share meals with my wife. In the evening, we sit and watch the mountains. This is a good life." "But what about security?" Hideaki pressed. "What if you become ill and can't work? Then my neighbors will help, as we help them when they need it," the farmer explained. "We've lived this way for generations. No one in this village goes hungry." Hideaki lay awake that night on the thin mat the farmer had provided, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. He thought about his own house, 10 times the size of this one, filled with exquisite possessions. He reflected on his immense wealth, far exceeding anything this farmer would ever see in his lifetime. Yet the farmer seemed genuinely content, not resigned to poverty, not feigning ignorance of his simple existence, but truly satisfied. He spoke of his small plot of land, his humble house, and his daily routine with sincere appreciation. He wasn't waiting for his life to improve before allowing himself to be happy. He was already happy with the life he had. Hideaki, despite all his wealth and comfort, couldn't say the same. He was constantly fixated on what he didn't yet possess, always comparing his situation to something better, always striving for more. When had he last experienced genuine satisfaction with what he already had? In the morning, the farmer's wife served a simple breakfast of rice, tea, and a pickled plum. Hideaki noticed details he had overlooked the night before: the care with which the wife prepared the food, the farmer's attentive pouring of tea, the genuine warmth in their interactions with each other. These people possessed very little in terms of material wealth, but they seemed rich in something he couldn't quite define. "Thank you for your hospitality," Hideaki said as he prepared to leave. "You've been very generous." "It's nothing," the farmer replied. "Safe travels." "May I ask you something? You seem content with your life. How is that possible, living so simply?" The farmer smiled. "I have everything I need: a roof over my head, food to eat, work that keeps me healthy, a wife I love, neighbors I trust, and mountains to admire. Every morning I wake up feeling grateful, and every evening I go to sleep feeling satisfied. What else is there?" Hideaki continued his journey, but the farmer's words lingered in his mind. Over the following days, as he traveled through the mountain villages, he began to see things in a new light. He noticed people who possessed very little by his standards, yet seemed to radiate a contentment he had never achieved despite his wealth. When he returned home, his house appeared different to him. It was still beautiful, still comfortable, but somehow excessive. He had rooms he never used, clothing he never wore, and possessions he had forgotten he even owned. He had been accumulating all of this, believing it would bring him satisfaction, but it had only brought him the burden of maintaining and protecting it all. He began to simplify his life, not drastically or suddenly, but gradually reducing his possessions to only those items he truly used and valued. As his possessions decreased, he expected to feel a sense of loss, but instead, he felt lighter and more free. He also changed how he approached his business. He still worked diligently, still maintained his trade, but he abandoned the relentless drive to expand, to acquire more, to reach the next level. He realized he already had enough. His business provided well for his needs, so why exhaust himself pursuing even more? His friends noticed the change and assumed he was giving up on his ambition. But Hideaki had discovered something they couldn't comprehend. He wasn't giving up, he was arriving. After years of striving for enough, he had come to the realization that he had been living in enough all along. He simply hadn't been able to see it because he was always looking ahead to something more. Years later, when people would ask him about his success, he would recount the story of the night he spent in the mountain farmer's house. I had great wealth, he would say, but that man was richer than I was, not in possessions, but in satisfaction. He knew he had enough. I didn't, and that knowing made all the difference. Now I'm wealthy in both ways. I have comfortable means, and I know it's enough. That second wealth is the one that truly brings peace. Hideaki's experience beautifully illustrates how possessing more doesn't necessarily equate to feeling like you have enough. He had wealth, comfort, and security, yet he was plagued by a constant sense of lack. The farmer, on the other hand, had very little by comparison but felt an abundance. The difference wasn't in their circumstances, but in their perception. The farmer wasn't pretending his life was easy or denying that more comfort would be pleasant. He simply recognized that what he had was sufficient. His small house kept the rain off, his plot of land provided food, and his life contained genuine satisfactions. Why waste his energy longing for more when he could focus on appreciating what was already present? Hideaki had been living in a future state of enough that never materialized. He thought, when I have this much, then I'll be satisfied. But each goal reached simply revealed another, more distant goal beyond it. The enough he was seeking was always just ahead, like a horizon that recedes as you approach it. The transformative shift came not from acquiring more, but from seeing what he already possessed with clearer eyes. His house was comfortable, his business was successful, and his life contained real pleasures and satisfactions. These things had always been true, but he couldn't appreciate them because he was too focused on what was still missing. When he began to simplify his life, reducing his possessions, he expected to feel a sense of loss, but instead found a profound sense of relief. This reveals a crucial insight. The things we accumulate, believing they will bring us satisfaction, often become burdens. They require maintenance, protection, space, and attention. The mere act of possessing them doesn't bring the peace we imagined. Sometimes the recognition of enough comes not from comparing ourselves to others, but from recognizing the abundance we've been overlooking in our own lives. In a village renowned for its beautiful gardens lived a woman named Kiku who cultivated flowers to sell at the market. She had inherited a small plot of land from her parents and had dedicated years to learning which flowers thrived best in that soil, which colors were most popular, and how to time the plantings to ensure blooms throughout the growing season. Her business was modest but steady. She earned enough to live a simple life, maintain her garden, and occasionally purchase something she needed. She worked hard, especially during planting and harvesting seasons, but she genuinely enjoyed her work and the peaceful rhythm of her days. Then her cousin Hana moved to the village. Hana had married a successful merchant and lived in a lavish house in the neighboring town. She would visit Kiku from time to time, always arriving with stories of her comfortable life, her exciting travels, the fascinating people she met, and the beautiful things her husband bought for her. At first, Kiku was happy for her cousin, but gradually something shifted within her. When Hana would visit, Kiku began to see her own life through a different, less favorable lens. Her small house seemed shabby compared to Hana's descriptions of her grand home. Her simple life seemed dull compared to Hana's tales of travels and social events. Her modest income seemed inadequate compared to Hana's wealth. She began to resent her work. The endless cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and selling. The same flowers year after year, the same market, the same customers. What had once felt peaceful now felt like a stifling limitation. What had once been satisfying now seemed like barely getting by. She found herself dwelling on all the things she didn't have. She couldn't afford the elegant clothing Hana wore. She couldn't travel to exotic cities. She couldn't dine at fancy restaurants or attend exclusive events. Her life, which had felt full enough before, now seemed utterly lacking. One morning, Kiku awoke feeling particularly burdened by dissatisfaction. She went to her garden to begin the day's work, but her heart wasn't in it. She looked at the flowers without truly seeing them, her mind preoccupied with Hana's stories from her latest visit about a festival in the capital and the exquisite new silk she had purchased. An elderly woman who lived nearby walked past and paused at the garden gate. "Your irises are beautiful this year," the woman commented. "May I come in and take a closer look?" Kiku nodded, barely paying attention. The woman slowly walked through the garden, stopping to admire the different flowers, gently touching their petals and bending down to inhale their fragrance. She lingered for a long time, clearly deriving immense pleasure from what she saw. "You have a true gift," the woman said finally. "This garden is a treasure. It's just flowers," Kiku replied dismissively. "Nothing special." "Nothing special?" the woman exclaimed. "Look at this color." She gestured toward a bed of blue irises. "Look at how they capture the morning light. And these," she moved to a cluster of pink peonies. "The way you've arranged them, the different heights, the complementary colors. This is truly beautiful work." "I suppose," Kiku said. "But it's just what I do. Plant flowers, sell them, repeat every year." The old woman looked at her with sharp, knowing eyes. "I have lived a long life and traveled to many places, and I can tell you that gardens like this are not common. Most people don't possess your skill or patience. You create beauty, and you do it so well that you've stopped noticing it yourself." After the woman left, Kiku stood in her garden, trying to see it through her visitor's eyes. She realized she hadn't truly looked at her flowers in weeks, too preoccupied with comparing her life to Hana's, and too focused on what she didn't have to appreciate what she did have. She walked through the garden slowly, emulating the old woman's approach. She looked at the irises, really looked at them. Their color was extraordinary, a blue so deep it was almost purple. The peonies were full and lush, their scent sweet in the morning air. The rows of different flowers created patterns of color that were genuinely lovely. She reflected on the years she had spent learning to cultivate these flowers, understanding the nuances of the soil, and mastering the timing of the seasons. She thought about the satisfaction of seeing tiny seeds she had planted transform into vibrant blooms. She thought about the smiles on her customers' faces when they saw her flowers at the market and how they told her how her flowers brighten their homes. She had been dismissing all of this as just what I do, as if it had no inherent value, simply because it was familiar to her. But it did have value. She created beauty. She worked in harmony with living things. She possessed skills that had taken years to develop, and she had work that she actually enjoyed when she wasn't busy comparing it to someone else's life. Over the following weeks, Kiku consciously practiced seeing her life the way the old woman had seen her garden, with fresh eyes, noticing what was actually present rather than filtering everything through what was lacking compared to Hana's life. She noticed that she woke naturally with the sunrise and that her days had a rhythm that felt good in her body. She noticed that working with soil and plants left her feeling calm in a way she had never felt when visiting bustling towns. She noticed the simple pleasure of watching things grow, of seeing her efforts yield beauty. She also noticed that her house, while simple, was comfortable and easy to maintain. She had enough space for what she needed, and she wasn't spending hours cleaning rooms she didn't use. She had neighbors she had known for years, people who would readily offer help if she needed it, and whom she helped in return. Her income was modest, yes, but she had enough. Food on her table, a solid roof over her head, warm clothes for the winter, and a little extra to save. She wasn't wealthy, But she wasn't struggling either. She was living adequately, even comfortably, when she wasn't measuring her life against someone else's. The next time Hana visited, Kiku listened to her stories with less resentment. She could appreciate that Hana enjoyed her life without feeling that her own life was therefore inadequate. They were simply different lives, each with its own unique satisfactions and challenges. Don't you ever wish you had more? Hana asked at one point. Your life seems so quiet. Kiku considered this. I used to, especially after your visits. I would think about all the things I didn't have, but I've realized that I have enough. This garden, this work, this life, it's enough for me. But don't you want to travel, to see new places? Sometimes I'm curious about other places, but am also content here, Kiku explained. There's always something new in the garden, even though it's the same ground every year. Different flowers each season, different light each day. I think I was so focused on what I didn't have that I stopped seeing the richness of what I do have. Years passed, and Kiku continued her simple work with her flowers, while Hana continued her more elaborate life in town. Both women were content in their own distinct ways. Kiku never became wealthy, never traveled to distant lands, never lived the kind of life Hana had. But she had stopped feeling that her life was lacking simply because it was different. When younger gardeners would come to learn from her, struggling with their own feelings of dissatisfaction, she would tell them the story of the time when she couldn't see the beauty of her own garden. We're trained to always want more, she would say, to believe that satisfaction is always just ahead in the next acquisition, the next achievement, the next change. But satisfaction isn't an amount to reach. It's a way of seeing what's already here. I grow the same flowers my mother grew on the same plot of land. Nothing dramatic or special, but when I see it clearly, it's enough. It's actually quite wonderful. The enough was here all along. Kiku's story underscores how the act of comparison can blind us to our own abundance. Before Hana's visits, Kiku had been content. She had enough, and she knew it. But exposure to her cousin's different lifestyle created a sense of lack that hadn't existed before. Suddenly, what had once felt sufficient now seemed inadequate. This is the insidious power of comparison. It takes our actual situation, which may be perfectly workable, and makes it seem deficient by measuring it against something else. Kiku's life hadn't fundamentally changed. Her circumstances were the same, but her perception of them shifted, and that shift created dissatisfaction where contentment had once flourished. The old woman's visit was crucial because it offered a radically different perspective. She saw Kiku's garden with fresh appreciation, precisely because she wasn't taking it for granted. Her genuine delight in the flowers helped Kiku to see them clearly again and to recognize the intrinsic value of what she had been dismissing as ordinary. The recognition of enough isn't about giving up on growth or change. Kiku could have chosen to pursue a different life if she had genuinely desired it. But she discovered that the dissatisfaction she had been experiencing stemmed not from a genuine longing for something different, but from comparing her situation to someone else's. When she saw her own life clearly, on its own terms, rather than measured against an external standard, she found it to be quite satisfying. Both Hideaki and Kiku discovered enough not by altering their circumstances, but by transforming their perspective. Hideaki had abundance, but couldn't experience it because he was perpetually focused on acquiring more. Kiku had sufficiency, but couldn't appreciate it because she was comparing it to something different. The shift from seeking more to recognizing enough is a subtle yet profound one. It's not about settling for less or abandoning improvement. It's about seeing clearly what is actually present rather than filtering everything through the lens of what's missing. It's about appreciating what we have rather than solely focusing on what we lack. This recognition brings a particular kind of peace, not the fleeting peace of finally having everything we want, which is always temporary because new wants inevitably arise, but the lasting peace of being content with what is, a state of being that can be present regardless of external circumstances. The farmer in his humble house had it. Kiku in her garden had it. Hideaki found it when he ceased his relentless pursuit of more. That peace is available to you right now in whatever circumstances you find yourself, not by changing anything about your situation, but by seeing it without the constant measuring and comparing, by noticing what's actually here rather than focusing solely on what isn't, by recognizing that enough isn't an amount to achieve, but a way of meeting what is. As you rest tonight, you might gently notice what you already have, not in a forced gratitude exercise, but simply by seeing what is present, the support beneath you, the breath moving easily, the simple fact of being alive, being here, being aware. These may seem like small things, ordinary things, but they are the very foundation of everything. And when we see them clearly, they are enough. They are actually quite wonderful. They always have been. Tonight, you've journeyed through some simple yet profound truths. You've seen how holding on too tightly breeds suffering, how attempting to control everything creates tension, how comparison steals joy, how resentment poisons the one who carries it, and how living anywhere but in the present moment means missing your actual life. These aren't complicated teachings. They are simply observations about how suffering arises and how peace becomes possible, not through striving or achievement, but through releasing what was never necessary to carry in the first place. You don't need to consciously remember everything you've heard tonight. These understandings work in their own way, gently settling into your awareness without force. What's meant to stay will stay. What's meant to help will help as you settle more deeply into rest. Now let yourself release even these teachings. You don't need to hold on to anything, not ideas, not insights, not even the stories you've heard. Everything can rest. Your breath continues on its own. Your body knows how to let go. The present moment is here, simple and complete, asking nothing of you. You can trust this moment exactly as it is. Whatever happened today can rest now. Whatever comes tomorrow will meet you when it arrives. Right now, there's only this gentle settling, this quiet release, this simple being here. Nothing to figure out, nothing to fix, nothing to become. Just this breath, this moment, this peaceful presence that was here all along, waiting patiently beneath the noise. Let yourself sink into rest, held by something larger than your thoughts, something that was here before you started listening and will be here when you wake. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.